Good morning, Tatsmewi. Good morning, Tatslahain. It is so exciting to see all of you. We are, I think, have everybody in as best as we can. Looks like I've got my auntie who's offering invocation this morning. Beanie, Tatsmewi, Katsiao. I think you all say lim limsh, lim lemsh, lim lemsh. I am still learning how to speak Coeur d'Alene, so bear with me. Inam winik was Ty Simpson. Sorry, Inam winik was Atit Watit. In was Mimipu Ayet. Inem nexasa hiwis timina ilp kanich the loitza kina katsiaya oikalo katsiaya hanyuat. Deep gratitude for all of you joining us this morning. My name is Ty Simpson. In the indigenous language of the Nez Perce tribe, I am called the storyteller. I am a director of social change for the Idaho Coalition Against Sexual and Domestic Violence, and will be your MC for this morning for the next 4 hours. Deep gratitude that you have joined us for the Next Steps Conference on Missing and Murdered Indigenous People and how we can interrupt and prevent this violence into the future. So we are going to get started with some introductions, but in our Indian way, we always start with an invocation so that our space is blessed and that we are coming together in a good way with a good heart. So my invitation is to Beanie, if you want to come off mute and go ahead and start that blessing and invocation for us this morning.
Lim Limch, thank you for the invite here today. Before we begin today, I had sang a healing song, and so the healing song is for all those that are involved with the MMIW, MMIP, for those families that need support and help, for those families that are grieving. The healing song I sang this morning for each and every one of them, and for ourselves that are also going through grief and a lot of our families may have been touched by or having personal people, women, men, children in our families that are missing. I ask Creator Grandfather Tupia today to be with us as we move forward. As we move forward in our efforts to find some help, support, increase awareness, and bring attention to where the attention needs to be. I ask that you come into each and every one of us, our hearts and our minds, and you keep each and every one of us safe and healthy, and protect us. Put a protection ring around all of us, and to give us some empowerment as we move forward with the work and the help and the support that each and every one of us are working towards. Creator Grandfather Tupia, I ask that you bless us with a good day, a good conference, and to be with us. Lem Limch, Creator Grandfather Tupia, hear our prayer.
Thank you so much, Beanie. I hope that grounded each of you as it did me. We raise our hands to the communities of the Niwa and Numu nations where I'm based. I raise my hands to the Shitsuamsh people, the Nimipu people, and the Kootenai people of Idaho as well. All of us come together in a good way so that we can carry this work forward and carry this medicine forward. So thank you so much for joining us this morning, Beanie. I certainly appreciate it. We'll go ahead and move into our shawl ceremony with Annie Foresman Adams out of Annie, I want you to actually come in and introduce yourself so I don't get your title wrong. We've worked together in a couple of different capacities. Annie is definitely a sister colleague of mine in this MMIWP work, and so we're thankful to have her with us and to offer this ceremony as well. Thank you so much, Annie.
Thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me. And yeah, there's been some changes over the past couple of months. So I just appreciate all the space that you hold and all of the great work you do and the great attitude. So my name is Annie Foresman Adams, and I have been involved in this work for a number of years in various capacities, both as an advocate and as the program director for the Washington State Native American Coalition Against Domestic Violence and Sexual Assault. And my newest role is with the Washington State Attorney General's Office, where I work as the policy analyst for the Washington State Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women and People Task Force. And so as I carry all of those roles with me, really today I join you, not representing any of those people, but coming to you as a sister and a colleague and a friend, to really ground the work that we do in honoring victims and in honoring the human side of all of this. And while the topic of this conversation is, next steps, it is also really important that we remember some of the everyday acts of empowerment and kindness and hope that we give people. And so because of that, or just in that spirit, I really would like to share a story about my grandmother. So my grandmother met my grandfather when he was stationed in Baltimore, Maryland in World War II. And she met him, and she very eagerly, a city girl from Baltimore, moved to what was a very rural reservation on the Suquamish Nation. And through all of that culture shock, she adapted really well, and she tried really hard to be a good community member and be a good wife and mother. And eventually she started taking just odd jobs and seasonal jobs throughout the community as a way of supporting her young family. And throughout that time, she spent a lot of time with other women who did the same thing. And she started to notice that as these women were getting paid, they often didn't have, even though they were working and getting paid, they often didn't have access to their money. And her conversations with them and her friendships with them, she quickly became to realize that it was because they weren't being allowed access to the money they were working for because of their husbands. And so my grandma started having these very quiet conversations with the women in her life and saying, let's just go open a bank account. Let's just go, here's the place you can stash the money. Just a little bit. And she would always say, just a little bit, just save it for a rainy day. If you need it, it'll be there. And if you don't need it, it'll still be there. And in 2017, my grandma passed away after a very long and full life. And at her funeral, women came up and families came up and told these stories of the indigenous, or told these stories of the money that they had saved and how when they did need it, it saved their lives. And decades later, those small acts of empowerment, my grandmother was not a public policy person. She was not a government official. She was a woman who saw suffering and worked to end suffering. And she saved the lives of community members who decades later remembered that. And I tell this story because it's easy both professionally and personally to think that the only way we can make change is to have the big policies or pass major whatever or change things on a systemic issue. in a systemic way. And that is absolutely important and something we all work every day to change. But what is equally important is that we work to empower victims and survivors and families every day through small acts of generosity, of kindness of spirit, and standing with them to make better communities and safer communities for the next generations. And so that's how I honor my grandma, whose wisdoms and teachings have never been lost on me. And I hope that wherever she is now, she is resting easy and knowing that I always have a little bit of money stashed on my bookcase for a rainy day. So with that, I'm going to just I'm going to just go into the shawl ceremony now. So I'm going to share my screen here. So I want to just tell you a little bit about the shawl ceremony. The shawl ceremony was gifted to tribal coalitions a number of years ago, and then formed it a number of times in various capacities, and I've kind of taken my own spin on it. So that's what's beautiful about our ceremonies, right? Is that every time we do them, we inject part of ourselves into it, and then it becomes something more than what it started as. So I wanted to just share this picture. This picture was of shawls that were made for Women's Spirit Coalition by my sister. And these were shared the last time we were able to gather in person out there in Coeur d'Alene at our last MMIWP event. So really excited to be here. Wish that we could be here in person. Looking forward to maybe being in person this spring. And I appreciate everything you all have done to keep everybody in our communities safe. So in the traditional shawl ceremony, we would put these shawls on chairs and we would leave them kind of up in the front as a way of honoring and remembering and holding space for victims and survivors throughout the event. So I just really ask that, we can't hold physical space for them, but we can hold spiritual and emotional space for them as we move through the events of today. So for the purple shawl, we place the purple shawl to honor and recognize victims of domestic violence. We honor their courage and their perseverance, and we are so proud of them for all of the things that they have done to keep themselves and their families safe. We place this teal shawl to honor and recognize victims of sexual assault for their commitment to healing, for their ability to love through immense pain, and for their just generosity and commitment to creating space for the healing of others. We lay a rainbow shawl that honors and recognizes Two-Spirit victims and survivors, the spiritual gifts that they've brought to our communities. It is because of them we are whole. And finally, we lay red shawls as an honor to honor those who have been missing who are missing or who have been murdered. These people who we come together to honor today have become the ancestors who guide our work, and we center them as we work through to create better systems and to fix systems that failed them. And we think about them all the time, and we hope that they are proud of the work that we are doing. And so I ask today that you just hold space for all of these victims and survivors and their families, some of whom have the answers, some of whom are still looking for justice, and that we just work together towards a common goal of honoring them every day. Thank you so much.
Hamakas Katsia'ao Annie, thank you so much for these reminders and for your stories and for the ceremony. For those of you who may not be familiar, these ceremonies are often iterations of practices that are very old for our people, and many of them are also shared across several Indigenous nations, and they help us to stay grounded and be reminded of why we do this work and who has carried this work forward for us and into us now, and a reminder of what we are working towards in the future. And that intergenerational wisdom is strong in each of us as Indigenous folks. And that's why these practices are an important part of any gathering. And to see how we've been able to adapt them virtually has been very clever. I've seen hand drums done well. I've seen prayers done well, shakers done well, now the shawl ceremony. So thank you so much for allowing us to have that practice during our time together, Annie. And we certainly look forward to our continued partnership across the region and across the state. So we will see you soon. Thanks so much. I'll move us into remarks. We have been blessed to have the acting United States Attorney for the District of Idaho, Rafael Gonzalez, is with us. And I have put him on the spot and asked him to say a few remarks out of his office to make sure that their voice is heard, and so that folks here understand that our work to end this violence in Indian country requires each of us from different communities, different agencies, and different organizations. So Rafael, we certainly are thankful to have you here today, and I'll give you the mic.
Right, Ty, thank you for that kind introduction. I appreciate it, and I most certainly appreciate the invitation to be here today with you all. I applaud the efforts here in Idaho and across the country, and really want to underscore the sustained attention on MMIP at the federal and state level, not only in Idaho, but in the region and in the nation. You know, we are at the U.S. Attorney's Office are committed to working to develop protocols, procedures, and guidelines on missing and murdered persons, especially in the cases among our Native communities, where our relationship with those communities is special and sacred. I want to thank Lane and Mel. You know, I read their report yesterday, had a chance to visit with Lane about the report. You know, these original research reports really help inform where we go forward. How do we develop these models and procedures? How do we identify stakeholders? How do we work together to advance the interests of the communities in this area? Stakeholders here in Idaho have engaged and continue to engage in collaborations, much like today's. And with that information and the relationship building, I'm very hopeful that progress can be made in this area. And today, the efforts and the attendance of all the people, I think we're up to 78 now, really highlight the will and commitment of a vast variety of people on this issue. So again, thank you for the invitation. I think Tracy Whalen from our office, as well as Elizabeth Tullisball, we're here to underscore our commitment to working together on this issue. Thank you, Ty.
Thank you, Rafael. Thank you so much for your partnership and your support. We are now probably close to 2 or 3 years, actually 3 years in the making of building this relationship with the USAO and agencies across the state and region. So it does help us to move some of this work forward in a policy place and an administrative place. So thank you so much. Now I want to invite my auntie, matriarch, mentor, executive director extraordinaire, Bernie Lacarte, who has been bringing us together and keeping this ball moving over the last 3 years. Bernie is literally the mastermind behind making sure we stay coordinated, we stay energetic, that we stay attentive to this issue, that it's not a hashtag for any of us, right? It's not a social media trend. A lot of us stay in this work and have been in this work for several years. Bernie, I think we're probably celebrating 17 years now that you've been where you're at, and 3 years of you guiding us in this work. So I would love for you to come in and speak into the space and grace us with your presence, because we love to be able to work with you and for you. So please come off mic, let us know where you're at this morning.
Thank you, everybody, and thank you, Ty. Good morning and welcome to our Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women / Persons Next Step Conference. My name is Bernie Lacarte, and I'm a Coeur d'Alene tribal elder, and I also manage the Stop Violence program for the Coeur d'Alene tribe for the past 17 years. I'd like to thank my collaborators on this project, and that is the Idaho Coalition Against Sexual and Domestic Violence, the Idaho Council, Boise State for all of their efforts to making this conference possible. Ty, Kelly, Melanie, Heather, Jessica, my staff, and my women's advisory staff. I want to thank you all for your support and all of your assistance, because I could not have done this without you. We decided to call this the Next Steps Conference because that's exactly what we'd like to address and focus on this gathering. We want to create a response plan to MMIP here in Idaho, as well as our surrounding region and communities and states. Most tribes nationwide are coming to the conclusion that we have many of the same challenges, irregardless of our geographic location. And that is, in regards to MMIP, there's certainly a lack of a central data collection site. We have jurisdiction issues. We have lack of collaboration and communicating across jurisdictions. We often lack appropriate laws addressing MMIP. And certainly we have a lack of consistent advocacy services for families of missing loved ones. There's been a lot of awareness recently on MMIP and certainly finding mass burials of Native children at boarding school sites. The numbers are now too great to ignore or to set aside. And there's been a lot of movement in addressing these issues and determining what needs to occur to bring some resolution for families and tribes and communities. This is a huge project and it will take many different entities. Not one can do it alone. So therefore, I cannot stress the importance of collaborative efforts on all levels for a matter of this magnitude and importance. So I ask that you all take information from these presentations today and come back to the Coeur d'Alene Casino. Hopefully we'll be in person on May 4th and May 5th for the part 2 of this conference. We hope to bring to fruition a formalized response for Idaho and our neighbors on missing and murdered Indigenous peoples. Again, thank you all for attending. Enjoy and stay safe. Thank you.
Thank you, Bernie Katsiao Limlemsh. Am I saying that right? I think I can say good morning and thank you in like 5 or 6 different Indigenous languages, so I'm getting better at this. Bernie, it is certainly an honor to be able to do this work with you. For those of you who may or may not know, you probably don't know, Bernie and the matriarch, the eldest sister of my mom's generation, went to school with Bernie. So it's like low-key terrifying if I mess up in this work that she'll call my auntie, and then it'll be, and then my mom gets notified, and then it's a whole thing. In Indian country, this is really funny because it just goes to show like there's always somebody watching in the way that we show up and serve community. So I again, just deeply grateful that I can work with you and do this work with you. I can share this work with my sister here, Melanie, and we're just kind of growing our community in a deep and unique and dynamic way in our work to end violence. And so we've got a lot of work to do. So as Patina Park has come off of camera, so we can get started there, a couple of housekeeping things for us, family. Each of our presenters will navigate their questions in a couple of different ways. So Patina will take questions kind of as we go, and I'll moderate them. So please use your Q&A function on the bottom of the screen. If you drop them in the chat, I will try to capture them and then recognize that you have asked a question. If there is a question that does get a little confusing sometimes, we'll invite you to come off mute if we can't answer the question clearly for you. So be prepared for that if you do ask a question of us. We have packed our agenda as much as we can. We did take a 2-day conference and put it into 4 hours virtually. So please, thank you for your patience and flexibility around that. some highlights we want you to take away. Why are we here? What gaps in the data are we missing? What comes next? How can you show up as advocates and community organizers? And I do want to underscore, Bernie, save the date for May 4th and 5th, where we can come together in person at the Coeur d'Alene Tribal Casino and Resort. And be prepared to work when you come to that conference. We are going to work together. We're getting tribal resolutions put together. We're getting legislation put together. We're getting policy and procedure put together. We're going to put it on paper and we're all going to commit to it. So this is our introduction. This is our homework today. We're going to get started with a little pre-work. And a lot of it will come from this new knowledge. We're going to hear from Patina, Melanie, Tracy, Elizabeth. So stay with us. We'll have a break after Patina. So we want to make sure that your human needs and bio breaks are honored. So bear with us. Go ahead and slide into my chat if you have any private questions, but otherwise, Patina, we are certainly happy to have you. I will let you go ahead and take the mic and introduce yourself. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Ty. It's nice to be here. So hiane washte matakuape, shante washte nepe chiuzape kito. So my name is Patina Park. I greet you all as my relatives with an open heart and hand. My family comes from both Cheyenne River and Standing Rock, but I am part of the adoption sweeps that occurred in the 60s and 70s. I was born in 1970, so I happened to be removed by my family at birth, but was raised by an Osage family because the adoption agency didn't realize they were Native. They presented to them as white farmers, and so they were allowed to adopt me. I am currently the Director of Tribal State Relations in the Office of Governor Walz and Lieutenant Peggy Flanagan. Lieutenant Governor Peggy Flanagan, she is the highest ranking Native woman elected to executive office in the United States, and it's had a profound impact on the state of Minnesota as far as how the state is interacting with the tribal nations. We share land with 11 sovereign nations, but also since 80% of our Native brothers and sisters live off those reservations, also how we interact with the urban and the non-reservation based communities. We're about less than 2% of the state, but as I'm sure is true and you where you're at, we are the highest of all the disparities, no matter what you're measuring, whether it's unsheltered homelessness, substance use disorder, child protection, out-of-home placement. In fact, Minnesota has the distinct honor of having the highest out-of-home placement rate of Native children in the country. Our rates are the same they were back in the 70s prior to the ICWA. So we have a lot of challenges here, but we are also, I think, doing some good work to start making some change. And now the issue of if MMIW or MMIR or just murdered and missing relatives is something that touches everyone in Indian country and really should touch everyone in the country because it's something that has been a fact in this country since the very beginning of first contact. Unfortunately, it's something that dominant culture has not seen or wanted to see. I know we speak a lot of being invisible, but I've been doing this work for almost 20 years now, and I don't feel that we're invisible anymore. I feel that we're deliberately ignored because people know the stats, they know the experience, and yet no focused attention has been given towards the issues that lead to it. I'm also sure that many of you have experienced a lot of the flood of feelings and emotions as we've watched the entire world pay rapt attention to the situation of the young woman Gabby Pieto, who went missing and then has been found recently and was murdered because they've just discovered or determined she was strangled. The world knows what happened to her. A massive amount of resources and attention continue to be used to find her boyfriend because everybody is sure he killed her. The focus and attention to her case when so many of our relatives go missing or are murdered with none of that attention is painful. I am very resentful of the fact that I can't even simply mourn for Gabby and her family without having this feeling of anger that no one cares that a good friend of mine, her female cousin, just went missing this week. And we're still looking for her and don't know where she is. But no one sees that story anywhere locally or nationally. So why is this, right? Why has the crisis of MMI, WMMIR been ignored, erased, and doesn't garner the attention it deserves? Well, I think first we have to understand why Native women are so vulnerable. And to do that, we must look to the past. You know, historical perspectives and narratives that have been used against us to justify genocide and erasure of our people in this country since first contact have compounded with each subsequent generation that has now created an environment where trauma impacts our community. It's pervasive, it's obvious, and the vulnerability to further trauma just continues to simmer within many of our populations. And so I want to start here by going to the past, looking at those first contacts and interactions. And I'm gonna not start with Columbus, right? Even though some continue to celebrate him. I'm going to start more when the Puritans and the colonial settlers started coming, because I want to highlight that at that time, tribes, many were matrilineal, right? Women held important social roles, economic roles within their tribes. I know within my tribe, women owned the property. The property passed through them. In fact, if we decided to divorce, we could divorce our husband, leave his shoes outside our home, and then he would go live with his family until another spouse was found. But patriarchal entitlement and authority was rejected. And really, I wouldn't even say rejected, it was just unknown. It didn't make any sense. The other thing was women were sexually autonomous, like this value on virginity that is really based in property and ownership also did not exist. And so when you compare and contrast that reality for Native people and the Puritan women and their men coming here, for a Puritan, women are inferior to men. In fact, women are the source of original sin. And if you can think about it and tease out Christianity and just look at it through a cultural lens, you can see how having women being the original source of sin and being cast out would have an impact on the role that that woman would be seen from then on. And so they have no independent legal rights. They're secondary to their husband, and their main role is mother and tending agriculture. They have, you know, if they don't have a husband, a father, or a son to, in essence, own them, they're really a null within society. And so you can think to yourself, when colonial people came and saw this different approach with how women had positions of power, it created some challenges for those patriarchal men. And so their reaction was to call us whores, whorish. And you can see this word used over and over in early writings of interactions with women. One man wrote how Native women seemed to be, the more whorish they were, the more higher their status. And so in the very beginning, looking at us with this very negative lens also assisted in the continued settlement and expansion in land because we were seen as less than, easy to remove. And then we got into removal, we shifted a little from just being whores to being breeders. And not just breeders, but uncontrollable breeders that just keep producing all these children, and that we're so ignorant to civilization that really the only response we can have as a civilized country is to push Native people out of the east side of the country. And we saw all the removals into reservations, Indian wars. And by considering Native women as breeders, and then even as low as being called animals, then there was no outrage in dominant society when we were hunted, kidnapped, prostituted, and when we had numerous massacres that occur. Google Native American massacres in the United States, and you will get one and one and one and one after another. All horrible, all generally focused on women and children and elderly. But there was no outrage at the time. In fact, the gentleman, Frank Baum, who wrote Wizard of Oz, wrote a very famous 3-part series of editorials in the Rapid City Journal, where he called for the extinction of the Plains Indians because it would be the civilized thing to do and the compassionate thing to do, because Native people were so unable to be civilized and we were suffering because of us. It would be best to just put us down like you would an animal or a sick livestock. Now we get into the assimilation in the boarding school era. Boarding school was touched on, and it's not something I want to spend a lot of time in other than to acknowledge the huge disruption it did to our traditional family structures, also to just the matrilineal role in tribes and in positions of making decisions and having an economic role, because taking away children is what they did in order to end the Indian Wars and then to force assimilation on us. Based on the freed slaves, because at the time they saw the slaves who'd been freed and thought, well, look how great they're doing. They're going to church, they're sending their kids to school, they're farming. They're much more civilized than the Native Americans. And since we can't enslave Native Americans now because of that pesky little constitutional amendment, we're going to assimilate them and force it on the children and kind of end this path of uncivilized behavior. And so we get into the Dawes allotment, right? Even there, land was only given to the male head of household. Like the nail on the coffin for any kind of matrilineal role within tribes. And then just a few decades later, the Merriam Report comes out and notes how Native women are idle, and that civilization, that they're a barrier to that within the home, poor spenders of income, right? That the race lacks leadership on the part of the women, was one of the conclusions made by the Merriam Report. And so we've gone from being a whore into breeders, into animals, into incapable, right? Negative, dominant narratives about us for hundreds of years, layered with on top of all of the trauma. And then we get into the termination era, we get into the Indian civil rights movement, we get into the sterilization in the 70s. And so all of that history has built up into a modern environment now where I don't know any Native women who haven't experienced violence, myself included. And most I know have experienced multiple forms. It's not a single instance, it's several across their lifetime. And it's almost normalized at this point, which is also a challenge even within the MMIW movement, within our communities, is getting people to start looking at relationships, looking at how we interact with each other in a or in a healthy traditional way, rather than one that's been informed by all this trauma. And so now when we kind of look at an individual and the cumulative effects that occurs, if I take up here in Minneapolis, we have a very high concentration of Native people within Minneapolis. We don't have the highest population. We have a lot within a very small radius. And if I take a young girl and think of her in that neighborhood, I know that within her families and friends, there is most likely substance use, which is a direct impact of trauma. Prostitution and survival sex is very normal behavior in order to survive and make rent and be sure you don't get evicted. We see the compounding impact of parents and grandparents who have been affected by fetal alcohol effect or disorder, as well as just long-term untreated mental health and mental illness. And then just poverty in and of itself, of having absolutely no money and the trauma that causes within a family. Well, if you look to the next layer of her neighborhood, which should be also a layer of protection, instead you see crime, we see food deserts, we see visible crime. I like to tell people up here, if you would like some heroin or meth, I can go take you right now to somewhere and we can pick it up. No matter what time of the day it is, I know where to get it because it's so out there, as is the prostitution. It's ongoing, it's pervasive, and we hear now that it's not just Women returning after a few decades, they're returning with their daughters and they're working together in order to survive. And a lot of that too is when we look at the majority society, right? All the government actions, like the federal government has been pretty targeted at eliminating us until very recent history. Within my lifetime, and I'm 50, in the 70s, they were doing sterilizations on Native women who were, and more likely full-blooded, in order to genocide the population again. And so urban relocation, the media glamorization of, sex as a marketing tool, targeting Native women. We're coming up on Halloween, and I'm sure just like many of you, I'm already bracing myself for going into spaces and seeing Pocahontas. Or I saw last year a costume, a very sexually explicit Native woman, and it was called No Reservations Required on her costume. So playing on reservations, playing on this highly sexualized. And if that's all you see, it's really hard for even young people to see like modern, healthy versions of Native people where we're thriving and we're doing well. And this also has an impact on how media looks at us, because if a Native woman goes missing and garners any attention here, we generally see a picture of a old arrest shot, right, when they're booked. Even though there's numerous pictures on Facebook of her laughing with her family, with her friends, we're already setting up this kind of subconscious narrative that, well, I'm sure she was drunk, or I'm sure she was, selling herself. I'm sure she was doing something that led to her being kidnapped or murdered. And so it's partly her fault. So we're not going to feel very sympathetic for it. In contrast, when you look at a young woman like Gabby, if I take a young white woman who's out in a suburb and I look at her family and friends, I don't generally see the same level of dysfunction. And they do provide a layer of buffer of protection around her against the evils that could be out there to take advantage. When you look at her neighborhood, you don't see the high, you don't say in your face prostitution. You don't see all the violence and the crime, because if you did in some of our higher end populations and suburbs, there would be outrage and a lot of attention given because of the danger to that population. And of course, someone like Gabby can go into any store, into any space and outside and see herself represented, right? There's even buffers of safety for women or white women, no matter where they go, because the entire world is kind of there for them. This is not true for our brown and black women or for our two-spirit. And so instead of providing layers of protection for a woman in our community, those layers push in and create this cumulative effect to increase the vulnerability. And so, if we have the highest rate of homelessness and unsheltered, runaway foster care, we also shouldn't be surprised that they get hurt, they get kidnapped, they get exploited during that time, right? But, I'm not telling most of you anything you don't know, but what do we do about it? Too often, some of the data problems, even with MMIW, is we get misidentified as white or Hispanic. And that misidentification is much broader than just not seeing who I am, right? It has a much broader impact to the issue as well to the response. And it wasn't, it was just a couple of months ago that, former Senator Rick Santorum said the land was discovered, that we birthed a nation from nothing is what he said. Or that on the day of MMIW, Instagram, if you recall, had a glitch and all the posts related to MMIW disappeared. They were all removed. Oh, I mean, we had to turn around and swamp it again, right? Any story with an MMIW hashtag was erased from Instagram, which just silenced, again, thousands of people sharing these stories. So what do? I think right now we have to approach it in a regional way because it's so broad. And so here in Minnesota, We have taken some steps that I'm pretty proud of in the recent years. I think first and foremost, we elected a Native woman as our lieutenant governor. Again, I cannot underscore enough what a profound impact that has had in kind of the focus internally within agencies as well as the governor's office itself around issues of Indigenous problems as well as strengths. And so, in their first legislative session after taking office, the lieutenant governor worked alongside Senator Mary Kunesh, Representative Jamie Becker Fenn, who are two Native legislators in the Minnesota legislature, and many advocates to start drafting and producing this legislation for the first task force looking at the issue of MMIW. Now, this legislation, though, this idea did not start with Lieutenant Governor, did not start in 2019. It really came from years and decades of advocacy, community leadership, as well as the fierce bravery of the victims, survivors, and their families who shared their stories. It was both incredibly powerful to observe their strength, but for me too, it was also frustrating and filled me with a bit of resentment that we have to have someone tell all their gory details of something that has happened to them. Basically, tear open their soul and spirit in order to, cry on the stand and beg to get legislators to listen and care. But that is what happened. Much of the testimony was heartbreaking. It made the issue real and it made it close to everyone's heart because it was happening in Minnesota. And so when the law passed, it had bipartisan support because of the sacrifice that these women made in telling those stories. So when it was signed in May of 2019, it included $150,000 to create this task force. And it was carried as a standalone bill, and it created 3 duties with it. One, to advise the Commissioner of Public Safety, to report to the legislature for recommendations on how to reduce and end violence against Indigenous women and girls, including members of the Two-Spirit community, and then also to serve as a liaison between commissioners, agencies, and organizations to provide legal, social, and community services. So it was a very broad group of individuals. And even that, though, I can say in the very beginning, in the drafting of the legislation, was a little controversial. Because many of us, and I'll say myself included, who've been working in this area for so long, also felt a little frustrated at this need to have a task force to identify what the underlying issues were, to delay it even further rather than relying on the voices and experience of those who've been doing the work to get to the solutions before having to go through the process. But unfortunately, because we're such a small population and because the legislature is made up of a lot of other people who need to be brought along and to learn, the task force included not just representatives from all 11 tribes, not just one seat like some task force do, and then you have the difficult challenge of reaching out to 11 sovereign nations and trying to figure out which one is willing to kind of serve the role for everyone. Here we had all 11. We also had representatives from the criminal justice, partner agencies, law enforcement, courts. We had prosecutors, we had federal partners, state agencies, and we also had advocates and those with lived experience, so that the task force also had, kind of champions from within to even redirect as it was doing its work. So in September of 2019, the task force began, and we met over 15 months in meetings across Minnesota in large group, and then we also had smaller subgroup meetings. We broke up into 3 work groups on the first time we met. We decided there were policy issues, that one group should look into the policy, another should look into the data challenges, and a third group was going to look at the resources. Because, of all the parables that use, or all the examples that use the parable of babies floating down a river, I think MMIW issues are the best one. Because I'm sure you've all heard about, you see a baby floating down the river, and someone grabs it out and then sees more babies, right? If babies are floating down the river, yes, you want to grab them out as soon as possible to identify them, to notify family, to hopefully rescue them, but if not, to at least give closure to the family. But you also need someone who's counting, because if it's just one baby, once the one baby is collected, your problem is solved. But in this instance, babies just keep floating down the river. So someone needs to count so that the broader population, dominant society, sees, oh yeah, this is in fact a problem. It's hard to create legislature unless you have strong statistics to demonstrate the problem for those who don't understand. And then finally, policy and resources, right? Someone needs to get at the front and stop the babies from falling into the water. But if you focus on any one area alone, the issue itself will not be solved. So any task force has to consider that it is 3 main focus areas that you have to kind of juggle with in order to really get to the issue itself. And that's what this task force worked really hard at doing. Now, there were challenges with the public meetings because we wanted to take public testimony from those who wanted to share, but also didn't want to create a situation of, and I hate to use it, but all I can think of is drama porn, right? Where people are telling their stories that are painful, they're triggering, they're re-traumatizing, and it's really just to serve a purpose so that someone can hear it, feel bad, but not have to experience it. We wanted to not do that. So we also were careful to ensure that we had people in the space who could do traditional healing that were healers. So that for women or men too who shared their stories, there was someone there to help them if they needed it. And we started it in a good way. We were a little less formal than some hearings that you see, because we really wanted to create the environment that people would feel comfortable sharing as much as they wanted to share. We also let them know from the very beginning, we didn't need to know the details, like that they weren't required to share either the details of their abduction or their assault or the details even of their loved one. What we really wanted to know is what had they needed? What do they see as areas that could have either prevented it or where they needed help when it happened, so that we could fill those gaps. So we really tried to keep it more focused to, forward thinking, problem solving, coming up with solutions rather than just kind of spinning around in the trauma. So the report took 15 months. We released it in December 2020, and I can share a link in the chat when I'm done. And it included 20 different recommendations, which I'll list through, but they also uncovered, some pretty shocking statistics that have helped kind of drive this work as well. We learned that though Native women make up less than 1% of the overall population in Minnesota, women and girls represent 9% of all homicides, which is a huge disparity. And even more, not surprising, quite frankly, but shocking for others was to know that in any given month between 2012 and 2020, there were anywhere from 27 Native and women girls missing to 54 every single month. Between 27 and 54 Native women and girls were known to be missing for 8 years. I think that really, for me, highlighted, like, I wasn't surprised by that number. I know some of the names of the people, but for others on the outside to learn this and to realize they'd paid no attention. And we got other people, non-Native people, asking, why don't we know this? Which is what we want. We want others to start asking that question. Why didn't I know this? And how is this happening? And so for the task force, they made the following mandates. 1, to create an office to provide ongoing attention to and leadership for the issues. to ensure adequate funding and resources so that they could do the recommendations. I don't know about you, but how often have legislatures passed great law and never funded it? So it never really happened. It just looked great on paper, but really didn't accomplish anything because they didn't fund it. That we should address systemic racism as an underlying problem and cause of the issue, eliminate poverty, and provide resources to meet basic needs, that there should be an annual MMIW report and dashboard so that we can see an overview of what the injustices may be now and how are we improving over time or not improving, so that we can make changes and pivot. To ensure that state and federal technical assistance and support is provided to tribes, to help participate fully in these data systems. And I would add, data systems that are not traditional data systems, but are indigenous data systems, which I know some of you on the call are experts on, and there's others across the country, to look at the data through an indigenous eye rather than through what usually is a criminal justice, purely criminal justice. Also supporting tribes in their sovereignty and increasing jurisdictional authority. So they can investigate, prosecute, sentence perpetrators of violence against Indigenous women and girls and Two-Spirit. Advocate for Congress to pass the Violence Against Women Act, right? VAWA, come on, let's get it done and improved. And in Minnesota, we have a law called Safe Harbor, which has removed those under 18 being charged with prostitution, which for many years in Minnesota, a 16-year-old could be arrested and convicted of prostitution, even though if money wasn't exchanged, it would have been a case of rape against the perpetrator, right? We finally changed that, but also recognizing need more money. That it should apply to all trafficking victims, not just those under 18. They expanded to 24, but it should expand to everybody. All people should have safe harbor if they are being trafficked. Increase personal and state resources, more training and resources, particularly in Indian country and also in greater Minnesota. Here in Minnesota, we have a strong urban population, but we have a very large rural area. And it's a very different dynamic out in the rural areas. So, I know the Super Bowl came here and everybody was like, oh, trafficking is going to increase. It's going to be horrible. Yeah, every year during hunting season, like trafficking increases exponentially. There are huge in ice fishing, right? Like anytime you get a group of men with a lot of liquid money, trafficking goes up. I mean, that's just a fact, regardless of what the thing is. An all sports game, a soccer, like it doesn't matter. So recognizing that too, so that we are getting information out into where it matters. Ensuring that all MMIW related deaths receive an autopsy and that are investigated thoroughly with a coroner and medical examiner to get a full story of what happened. Strengthen all the trauma-informed victim-centered responses for law enforcement, courts, and the health system. Particularly for Indigenous sexual assault, trafficking, and violence survivors. And this is one I strongly agree with, is address the harm the child welfare system has done to our families and our communities. And see that child welfare system, as it is run right now, is the first grooming step that occurs within the trafficking and violence perpetuated, particularly against our young adults. Age-appropriate cultural response, a trauma-informed education about healthy relationships and consent to all students in all schools, K through 12. Increase awareness among general public, and to prevent and reduce forms of trafficking, sexual exploitation, normalized violence. Make sure that all of the initiatives and decisions are informed by Native women and girls, especially those with lived experience. And then also to promote healing. Not just of survivors and relatives, but also of perpetrators and of entire communities, so that we can support culturally responsive and community-led efforts to get to the core. So in those recommendations, the office is something that the governor's office actually had put in its budget even before the recommendations came out. Again, from the power of having a lieutenant governor who is Native and who has had lived experience, saw immediately that the task force was not enough. We needed a centralized location. And so this office now, they are currently recruiting for the director of, the executive director, I think they're calling it, is going to be responsible for developing those connections and working partnerships across agencies, organizations, state, tribal governments, federal, as well as within Canada. Since we share a border with Canada, the issue there is directly related to us. The Thunder Bay to the Duluth trafficking is generations old, and we've known about it, and now we can do some targeted work on it. They'll also advocate for change at the legislature and change at the federal level to better address the issue. Look at systemic failures that continue to perpetuate the systems and the responses that lead to vulnerability. Look at the injustices within the criminal justice system, particularly towards the relatives. We heard that a lot in the testimony, less about how about the victims themselves, but how the families were treated, how they weren't taken seriously, that no one would even take a missing person report, that in many instances the families were the ones who found their loved one because they're the ones who organized the search parties, because police, both tribal and state, did not pay any attention. And then they are going to also continually evaluate their office, right? Our idea is they need to continually improve and hopefully receive even more funding as the need comes. They will be doing case reviews of past cases, so kind of those old cold cases, trying to renew them, try to even pull forth prosecution, but also I'm hoping they will also look at justice through a lens of Indigenous responses and not just be so focused on a state criminal justice response, because that often does more harm actually in communities, I think, than it does really good, by the way that it's so sterile and so kind of driven by outcomes. And then they're going to convene a multi-jurisdictional advisory council that will basically mirror the makeup and expertise that was in the task force, but with new members to help support and guide them. So again, local and state, local, federal kind of law enforcement, prosecution court, as well as tribes. I hope that they will include tribal courts and tribal law enforcement rather than just tribal leadership, because I'm sure within the systems that deal with this most, they have a lot of great ideas. And then they will be also hiring, I believe, a staff of 3 once the director is chosen. So we're excited and hope that at the beginning of the year, we'll have that office up and running and we'll have even more information to share for people. But the other thing that the Lieutenant Governor was pretty firm about is having an office alone is not enough. We also have to look at where we're already doing work across the state and help improve the resources and the support for them. And so they included an additional 2.5 million on top of the current 2 million to go through the Office of Justice Sex Trafficking Grants. So this directly supports local agencies and survivor navigators support, as well as related service providers to assist in trafficking, and both to get to the problem as well as to help those who've been a victim of it. And then for victim survivor grants, also set aside $10 million to provide specifically crime victim and survivor resources to address those cycles of violence that occur. We provide funding for victims of crime, for domestic, sexual assault, child abuse. However, it doesn't always cover all of the crime victim needs. So direct client assistance and even innovative measures to try to stop those cycles of violence and impact are something that this additional funding is trying to look for. We also included a little over $1 million for a Minnesota Heals program in the Office of Justice. So grants for community-led healing following a traumatic event, statewide critical incident stress management services, particularly for first responders, and then grants for trauma and burial costs following an officer-involved death. the situation with George Floyd here in Minnesota led to a global awakening, but it also had a response here in Minnesota that, we heard time and time again from families that the way they were treated when their loved one was a victim of police involved homicide was not right. And so we also wanted to add funding to help support those, so that, from my perspective, even if this individual went in and, shot an entire kindergarten and then killed Santa, their loved ones still love them and need services. Regardless of the heinous crime the individual perpetrator may have committed, we cannot lose sight of their family and the support that that family needs in addition to the victims' families. And so trying to take a more holistic approach to how we address even just criminal justice. And then the other thing we see very strongly here in Minnesota is the direct connection between unsheltered homelessness and trauma. MMIW, sexual violence, domestic violence. And so we increased funding for emergency shelters by $5 million a year. We supported counties and tribes, again, also with an additional $5 million to integrate housing services with human services. We've invested over $20 million to address to prioritize children and families, but specifically within African American, American Indian, and LGBTQI communities, because they're the ones who are experiencing the highest level of all the worst things. And so we really need to refocus our resources towards those individuals instead of giving them, if we're 1% of the population and we only get 1% of the overall funding, it's never going to fix anything and only just continue to perpetuate it. We also recognizing this Indigenous education for all also has an impact. Like the erasure and invisibility is pervasive because no one learns about us ever. History has been whitewashed. Students are not taught full history. And so we also put in investments into training around ICWA, training around our Minnesota Family Preservation Act, continued development, improvement for Indigenous child welfare training for counties, setting aside money for Head Start, tribal early learning packages, as well as just this Indian education for all. Trying to bring awareness to people of who we are, because then they're going to be more likely to see when we're having these issues and challenges. And so, what else can be done? Well, again, we need to push for true history to be taught into our schools, and push against the whitewashing, and not just for Indigenous, just history overall. The United States, history is based a lot on a lie. Multiple lies over and over that are perpetuated on and on from education, unless you take special classes. I still, when I teach history, I get someone in the class still like, I had no idea. They're angry, right? Sometimes they're mad at me and tell me I'm lying, right? If we address this early on, we wouldn't have this defensive push against anything related to Native people or African American or any of our BIPOC communities, because people would already have the baseline understanding of what the history has been. There need to be more task forces at regional levels, because things that are true in Minnesota are going to be very different than things that are in Idaho, or different in Florida, different in New Mexico, right? The underlying issues of homelessness, child protection, yes, those are all very similar, but there's also specific nuances within regions that have to be addressed. And then we also need a national task force, a national organization that can be focused on coordinating across all of these different groups, so that we have the task forces, the offices, anything being done at a state level, so they can be coordinated and collaborated together to create those nationwide recommendations, which can lead to federal policy and federal asks and changes. I think we also desperately need to consider intersectionality when we look at this issue. Not just within the identity of the people experiencing it, but also within the fact of MMIW crosses child protection, homelessness, substance use disorder, trauma, health. But we look at all of these issues in silos. And now we have a silo of MMIW. We need to break that silo apart and instead cross all the others and see how they're all interconnected and how we can address MMIW by addressing poverty, addressing unsheltered homelessness, addressing the disparities in child welfare, so that we can strengthen our families. And instead of creating this dynamic where family, neighborhood, and the broader community are pushing in on our community, instead we have layers of protection at each one, family and friends to neighborhood as well as nationally. And a lot of this comes down to investments. You know, we need flexible resources provided at an amount that will address underlying factors, and they're paid directly to culturally powered agencies that are doing the work with minimal reporting requirements, right? We should not be spending 40% of our time reporting and only 60% of the time doing the work. We should be spending 98% of the time doing the work, and you trust us because of our outcomes. Don't mistrust that because we're an Indigenous or a culturally powered agency, we don't know what we're doing. We need to increase funding for VAWA and all violence prevention and victim services programs across the board. We need to increase funding for the FBI to create a nationwide specialized MMIW task force that can investigate and prosecute these cases while providing annual reports on prevalence, the rates of successful prosecution, and any barriers they've identified during the successful resolution of these cases. We need a much more focused and experienced group looking at these cold cases, because these are hard. Like, you know, they say if within 48 hours you don't find the missing person or find stuff, the case goes cold. Some of these cases are 2, 10, 20 years old. And so we're going to need it funded at a level that the expertise it needs is there. And another thing I think would be helpful is, you know, CMS provides an all-inclusive billing system with tribes through Indian Health Services for mental health and chemical health services. They need to extend that all-inclusive billing to urban Native organizations that also provide these services, so that we don't have to compete against the, you know, Twin Cities United Way or the Lutheran Social Services, these really large, huge, you know, organizations with a staff of grant writers. But instead, we're reimbursed at a level that supports the whole agency so that we can use cultural healing modalities and not just clinical. And this is seen as a federally allowed service. Because at the core of everything, our community needs healing. If we don't heal the trauma that we have experienced for many generations, it's very difficult to get ahead of a lot of these problems. And that healing needs to be the focus and the strengthening of the families. And then finally, I would say tribal services areas are very connected to the reservation and very limited. If the federal government would extend tribal service areas from the reservations to reach out into urban areas where a lot of their population is, 80% of Native people are now in urban areas, according to the recent census. That can facilitate partnerships with those urban organizations, which allow a stretching of federal funding. So if a tribe is saying their membership, those enrollment numbers can also then extend to the members living off the tribal lands. Now they're limited too. But I would also say that then the funding needs to match the need rather than just being less for each individual member. So we have a long way to go, but I'm still very heartened. Like 20 years ago, no one talked about this stuff at all, right? No one. Now we have, you know, about 12 years ago, an agency I was leading released a report. No one really cared. Urban Indian Health Institute released a report. People start caring. Canada's report, people have started to care. That dominant culture being aware is helping to raise awareness. But we also have to acknowledge that if we don't take some of these steps locally now, dominant society's attention is very limited. And it won't be long before there's a new hashtag they're paying attention to. And so we really need to kind of grab this moment and move forward these agendas around what our community needs before it's too late. And I'm sorry, I only left 5 minutes for questions. I meant to leave more, but I got to talking, and Melanie can attest to this. It's hard for me to stop when I start.
Thank you, Himakas Katsiaya Patina. Deep gratitude for sharing that knowledge. If you notice, I've been putting some highlights in just to kind of, pick out just all of these knowledge bombs around like how we can do this work together. And, one of the things that I'm hearing too, and I love this, and our colleague out at Urban Indian Health Institute was quoted in an article that says, don't come to Indigenous people because you think we have problems, come to Indigenous people because we have the answers. And that really is like how we can change and navigate some of these issues that we're seeing. And then this piece about healing, right? Like I tell people all the time that this violence in Indian country is old violence. This is not new for us. This has been compounded, forced sterilization, forced displacement, violent disconnection from our communities. There's just so much that is impacting how we navigate these contemporary issues. There are a couple of minutes. We decolonize time a little bit. We're going to do some transparent facilitation around who goes next and how much time. So if you have questions, I'm going to leave a moment for y'all to answer or to ask in the chat. And then some of these questions I'm also happy to take and convey to Patina, or we can try to navigate them at the Idaho Coalition as well. So if you have a question, please go ahead and drop that in the Q&A function. If you have a question, please drop it in the chat. We can read it out loud. I know that there was a lot of information there, and that's always the struggle, right? We have literally hours of information we can speak to, and then generally only have 45 minutes to an hour to get it out. But we certainly appreciate what we do get from you. I'm not seeing any questions coming through at this point. I'm going to give folks a moment to type away.
And people should also feel free to reach out to me. I can put my email here in the chat.
Thank you so much for that.
And I also put the link to the full report if you'd like to read it.
Yeah, I think a couple of us put that in there. Thank you so much, Patina. All right, I'm going to go ahead and move us along then. I just can't thank you enough for taking on this keynote under short notice. Certainly sending our love and condolences to our auntie out west for navigating a loss and her family. But thank you for stepping in. We certainly appreciate it.
It was my pleasure. Plamia, everyone. Take care.
Take care, Patina. Have a good one. All right, I'm gonna invite all of us to take a deep breath. We heard a lot of knowledge in that moment. Some of you are starting to drop questions now. And again, the invitation is for you to drop the questions as they arise for you. We are going to move into a break. If I'm not mistaken, Bernie, can I have a nod for that? Yes. Okay. I want to make sure there were some adjustments to a couple of different agendas we had, and I want to make sure I keep us on pace. But before we go into break, and then when we come back from break, we're going to do this. I see your questions coming in. You will see a poll launching right now. If you can go ahead and answer that poll. Who are you? Who do you represent? It helps us to know, like, are you from a state agency, a federal agency, community, grassroots, tribal, citizen, nonprofit? We need all of that information because, like Patina said, this data informs the way that we navigate and provide service. So please answer this poll. I'm going to leave it up for about a minute or so before we move into break. Somebody asked about the Instagram erasure. So the algorithms that are kind of fuel the what we see and navigate on social media are automated, and MMIW, anything that was tagged with MMIW or MMIWG, I think was removed as part of that glitch at Instagram. And this took place about a month ago. Instagram, of course, gave us a very whitewashed apology around like, oh, it's, you know, a mistake, systemic mistake, we don't know how to fix it. So of course, again, this is technology as a curse, right? Like, what are these algorithms and how are they built in such a way where, you know, they are erasing us from these narratives on social media? There was a point that Patina mentioned, data collection being an Indigenous lens. I'm actually gonna, thank you for asking that question. There is a reason why we brought Mel Filmore from Boise State in to start this data process, this data exploration process in Idaho. And I'm about 90% sure that Melanie will touch on that because she usually does. Melanie, go ahead and nod to me that you're gonna answer something around that question. All right, perfect. So we'll save that one. Some of y'all are answering some really great questions. Could you highlight a way or best ways to build trust within communities of tribal and non-tribal community members? I have a whole session on that from our conference last year, so I will drop that video in. It is entitled Best Practices for Serving Indigenous Communities. So there's a conversation there, and I think that that goes into a much deeper dive on, one, these historical atrocities that have taken place against Indigenous people and how we can better rebuild those bridges and relationships now. So Sam, thank you for asking that question, and I'll drop that as a resource for you in the chat shortly. For those of you who may not have been aware, the Idaho Coalition Against Sexual and Domestic Violence last year hosted a conference on missing and murdered Indigenous people as well, guided by and informed by Bernie. And so that series of videos was recorded and is available on YouTube. So I think that that may be a resource for filling in some gaps if you don't have them here. Hey, thank you all for filling out this poll. I'm gonna take a quick screenshot of that and then close it. I invite y'all to take a break. We'll take about 10-15 minutes, I think is what we have scheduled. 15 minutes is what we have scheduled. This is your opportunity to stretch out, walk around, get some coffee. I'm gonna cut your break just a little short, so I'm gonna invite you back here at 45. So that's either 11:45 Idaho time or, sorry, Boise time, or 10:45 Pacific time. We're across 2 different time zones. So 45 of the hour, please come back at that time. I'll play some music for y'all, and we will see you back here shortly. And you'll hear me after a little bit, kind of call you back in a few minutes. So just to give you a heads up. So thank you all. Honor your human needs. Katsiaya. Thank you all so much. I hope that you were able to get some water, get a cup of coffee, stretch your legs, all of those things. Lovely, y'all are coming back. Thank you for answering the poll. This poll is about familiarity, y'all. How familiar are you with this issue? If you're new to it, you are welcome to this movement. If you are very familiar, we'll have another question around needs. I'm very thankful that Patina discussed like what has been working in Minnesota and how can we emulate that in our region in Idaho, our neighboring states, Nevada, Utah, Wyoming, Montana, Washington, and Oregon. And if you are from those states, I mean, let us know, let us stay in community and in network together. I think it's important that, like Patina said, that we build some regional partnership around this. I'm going to go ahead and share these results to y'all so you can see. So we've got folks who are somewhat familiar, some of you who are very familiar, some of you still learning. And this, for those of you who are newly exposed, thank you for being here and thank you for being willing to learn. This is very difficult work. You're walking into some of the most traumatizing and triggering work for those of us who are Indigenous, and you are now partners in community in this work with us. So thank you for being here. I'm going to go ahead and save that information for myself. So we're going to welcome to our virtual stage, Melanie Filmore and Lane. I'm going to probably butcher your last name, Gillespie. Is that how we say that? Lane Gillespie?
Close enough.
Close enough. And so this is where we get into a little bit of the my favorite part, along like the dirty I don't know, whatever we can call it, but the nerdy stuff around data. I'm going to give you a little bit of history. So Auntie Bernie Lacarte pulled us together for a summit in the winter of 2019. And at that table were many of the folks that you're going to see presenting here. Tracy, Waylon and Elizabeth from Department of Justice, United States Attorney was there, I think, Acting Attorney USAO Rafael was there with us as well, Tanea from Idaho State Police, Jessica. So we've been collaborating over the course of years. And so at that summit, we realized that there was a huge gap in data, a huge lack of information sharing around missing and murdered Indigenous people in Idaho. I do want to make a note for those of you who are not familiar. In Idaho, we have more missing men than we do women, which is why you hear us use interchangeably missing and murdered Indigenous women or missing and murdered Indigenous people. We want to make sure that we're honoring those who identify as men, who also identify as queer, trans, or two-spirit of our community as well, because they are most impacted by this violence. Please excuse my dogs. They decided to get up and shake. After our summit in December, we moved to pass a joint resolution out of the Idaho legislature that identified a missing Indigenous Persons Day and Awareness Day. And that's always a start, because there were several legislators in Idaho who have no idea that this was an issue. They don't have any strong understanding of settler colonialism and the impact of it on Indigenous communities. They only know casinos, they know elected tribal leadership, but they don't know some of this deep nitty-gritty of violence that's impacting our community. So we made some progress there. As part of that legislation passing, we were also able to see an allocation of $30,000 distributed through the Idaho Council on Domestic Violence and Victim Assistance to support a research project on data associated with MMIWP in Idaho, which we have tapped Melanie to do and are very grateful for that. So I do want to uplift a couple of these questions that came through, because I do think that they will be covered as part of Melanie and Lane's presentation. What is an Indigenous lens around data collection? I know Melanie will speak to that. She speaks to that every time and does it very well. And then there were a couple of questions around the correlation between missing and murdered Indigenous people and our historical trauma. I want to uplift that our sister colleague Sheena has, you can connect with Sheena, who's an attendee, not a panelist today, but actually has written, I believe, their thesis and dissertation, or maybe just their thesis around that. So please feel free to connect with each other in the chat as you see questions come up that you have expertise or strong understanding around. We really encourage that sort of networking. So that was the initial questions. I do see a question that came from folks around MMIP and trafficking. I will touch on that shortly. And then at the end, we'll kind of culminate around Kelly's question: how can we support folks, survivors and families, financially, culturally, et cetera. So I'm just acknowledging and naming your questions. Thank you for offering those to us, and we will address those during our time today. So Melanie and Lane, I invite you to come off mute, introduce yourselves, and then I will stop sharing, Melanie, so that you can share, and then we'll dive deep. We've got about 45-ish minutes to get a lot of knowledge out to the world. Thank you all so much for being here.
Yes, thank you. Give me just a second here. I'm trying to adjust my slides in the presentation. You should be able to see that. You can see the presentation, hopefully.
I can see the presentation, and we can.
Right. So we will just get started. We have a lot of information to cover. Lilam Petuashte Machiapi Melanie Machiupazapi. Such a good time to be together with you and my relatives. I greet you with a happy heart. I just really appreciate the grounding in the ceremony already given today by Annie. I also just want to thank the work of Patina Park. I was able to do research with Patina in 2019 and spend a great deal of time communicating and just being in community with her in her work at the Indian Women's Resource Center in Minneapolis, and watched her transition into the tribal liaison for the state of Minnesota. So, and she pretty much said all the things. So I feel like my work is She did the heavy lifting, so there's very little need for me to do a lot of speaking. I'm going to let Elaine introduce herself.
I'm Lane Gillespie, and I'm an associate professor in the criminal justice program at Boise State. And I welcomed the opportunity to work with Mel in order to put this report together and to try to be responsive to the needs and requests for additional data on this topic. And I'm just very happy to be here.
Thank you. And I'm Mel Filmore. I am a second-year PhD student in public policy and administration through the School of Public Service at Boise State University. We really just want to acknowledge the work. This has been, as Ty mentioned, this has been the work of many years of engagement with Idaho tribal communities, making this the MMIP an issue and bringing it to the policy agenda in Idaho. We want to thank the stakeholders who we were able to interview and who met with us repeatedly over and over and over again to navigate us through this process and to just be available to us when we have questions, when we needed to access information and data. We want to thank Leah Van Pelt, who is a member of the Confederated Tribes of the Umatilla Reservation, and her family has been a long-time resident in the Boise Valley, Treasure Valley area. And we also want to just acknowledge that, again, this was the effort of so many folks to get this recognized on the formal agenda, and to make the research possible is only possible through community effort. We also want to honor families and community members who've lost loved ones. And we have had families reach out to us and ask us questions about how to navigate the process of missing persons cases and investigation. We acknowledge that this report is just a first step to many to understand this issue. And if you look at that quote at the bottom, this quote has just stuck with me as I have been working on the report with Lane, that our relatives have believed that their family members are forgotten. And I always think that an opportunity for us to, make these issues, talk about them and make them public. And part of research is to provide those opportunities for those stories to be uplifted and to know that our relatives are not forgotten. And that there are relatives that we have right here in Idaho who believe that their relatives have been forgotten.
So as you can tell, Mel and I are going to bounce back and forth between the two of us to present on different aspects of the report. So in this presentation, we're going to touch on some general background content, which has been supplemented by some of the qualitative findings, and in particular, some of the quotes from the key stakeholders that were interviewed. And then we're going to shift gears and cover what we've found from the quantitative data. And you can see there on the slide the list of the various quantitative data sets that we were able to explore and present findings on in the context of this report. And then we'll shift to the recommendations, which are also supplemented with some of those qualitative quotes from the stakeholder interviews. So I'll turn it back over to Mel to get us started.
I feel like Patina did a lot of the heavy lifting on contextualizing the issue of MMIP. And so there is very little that I do. She covered it also. But what I would want to just highlight is my area of, I'm not an expert, but I have spent much of my research career, my limited research career, studying the administrative records and the ways that data collection has been carried out on Indigenous people. And it certainly was used as a tool to dominate over Indigenous people. So the way that the federal government employed multiple strategies of systemic domination over Indigenous peoples, the forced removal and location of entire tribes, the federal government did so utilizing administrative data to create federally recognized tribal land, to reallocate land to families, breaking up communal living practices, and to remove children from families through boarding school and adoption practices. And, Patina really highlighted her own story as an adoptee. My dad was also an adoptee, a boarding school survivor himself. And that when those processes happened with American Indian children, often records were destroyed and prevented families from reconnecting. And so it's really important to recognize that administrative data has been used on Indigenous people to remove them to reservation land. And that process has played out differently with each individual tribe, has their own history of the ways that which administrative data has been used on American Indian people. It's also important to remember that criminological research historically studied whites compared to non-whites or whites compared to blacks, resulting in less understanding of victimization experiences among racial and ethnic minorities. And recent research has worked to address this. Research at the national, state, and local levels has begun to understand racial disparities, and studies have found, again, as Patina has highlighted, as Ty has highlighted, studies have found Indigenous persons suffer from the highest rate of victimization, higher than the national averages. And certainly we will talk about that in some of our data. Violent victimization is relevant to MMIP as often there are links between experiences of abuse, neglect, manipulation, risk of going missing, and experiencing lethal violence. And this has been confirmed by many state reports analogous to ours. State reports have found that homicide rate for American Indian people is 8 times higher than the rate of white folks. That is a disproportionate number of female homicide victims that are Indigenous, and that Indigenous people may stay missing for longer than their white counterparts. And so Idaho has been, I think one of the most important things that I heard from talking with so many stakeholders and folks working on the ground was when I was sharing the report, was somebody shared with me that they were living this. And that was sort of a real important moment for me as a researcher, that we got the report right, in the sense that it confirms the existence and the experiences of the people who are working on this issue. And that matters to me as an Indigenous researcher. And, that HCR 33 passed in March 2020, recognizing missing and murdered Indigenous people as a crisis in Idaho, designates May 5th as a day of awareness, and supports the efforts to further investigate incidence rates and the underlying causes, which are all highlighted by, it's highlighted by the data, but it's also highlighted by the experiences and the lived realities of our tribal domestic violence and our service providers and folks working in the court system. So it's important to start with some baseline information on, this is based off of census data. Natives are only second to the cumulative effect of some other race. The 2020 census has seen the expanse of Indigenous identification based on the acceptance of the 2020 census for multiple identities. So now folks are able to identify as mixed race or multiple. And certainly Idaho we have seen the 2020 data and know that folks can identify as American Indian or Alaska Native, or in combination with other races, where previous data only allowed you to select one in the census. And so the idea that more, that there seems to be an increase of American Indian people in certain locations that maybe have been previously unknown is now being made available. And to also echo what Patina has said, that 80% of American Indian people do live in urban areas, which is also part of and very relevant to the challenge of addressing missing and murdered Indigenous people. So one of the challenges that Idaho faces is we are part of one of a handful of states that has adopted Public Law 280, which allows for provisional jurisdiction of criminal offenses to counties have provisional jurisdiction over criminal offenses on Indian land. And we only, unlike some states who have PL 280 expands a lot of areas where counties are able to intervene on tribal land, we only have 7 areas, which makes Idaho unique in the level of the ways that we have applied PL 280. And so it's important to understand that Idaho's application of PL 280 is different than other states that are PL 280 states and that have mixed jurisdiction or agencies who can respond to crime on tribal land. And those include juvenile delinquency, youth rehabilitation, dependents, neglected, abused children, and operation of and management of motor vehicles upon highways and roads. That tends to affect cases of DUI or and even sometimes the movement of Indigenous people who are traveling on main highways. It's important to also remember that tribes have their own justice system in the process misdemeanors, civil infractions, and offenses perpetrated by tribal residents. And so the history of the application of the General Crimes Act and the Major Crimes Act, that federal laws on Indian country granting federal jurisdiction over Indians who commit major felonies results in the U.S. Attorney's Office holding jurisdiction over major crimes committed on reservations. And so that is our direct connection to the U.S. Attorney's Office, who we heard from briefly earlier, that tribal court systems are able to try misdemeanor civil infractions and offenses perpetrated by tribal members. All tribes have their own law enforcement services, either with their own police departments or the BIA. But for major crimes, those are going to be adjudicated and handled by the U.S. Attorney's Office. There are some tribes, very large tribes, right? We're talking like Cherokee Muskogee Creek Nation in Oklahoma, that are able to qualify for what's called the Tribal Law and Order Act, which expands their ability to prosecute non-tribal persons who commit crime on tribal land. But those tribes have to meet certain requirements, including jury pooling that includes Native and non-Native people for those things. No tribes in Idaho enact the Tribal Law and Order Act, but it's important to note because there is a wide variety of access to resources within the tribal court system, and Idaho does not qualify for those expanded resources that are dedicated to things like the Tribal Law and Order Act. Understanding jurisdiction in Idaho is complicated for 2 reasons. One is that there are legal definitions of jurisdiction that guide the legitimate use of government authority. And so by that, we're talking about that officers and the federal government have the impact to exercise authority and force against citizens, right, through law enforcement. But the second issue is that implementation of identifying jurisdiction relies on both formal and informal practices by numerous institutions and actors. So some tribal and state agencies have established formal agreements, and individuals are trained and behaviors are guided by those interactions, right? And some jurisdictional relationships are the result of interactions playing out over time without formal policies or documentation guiding interactions. And so it's important to understand that a tribal jurisdiction and the interactions between law enforcement agencies on and off tribe, some agencies have a history of having formal agreements, and there's a lot of instances where tribal jurisdiction has been identified through informal processes, meaning that neither the tribe or counties and states have been operating and identifying jurisdiction without formal policies. And certainly that was a part of the perceptions of jurisdiction in our interviews, right? That folks that may not actually understand how informal agreements have worked out over a long year's worth of time. And certainly some of the things that we were able to interview and to capture in the qualitative data is when there is a single case of a missing or murdered Indigenous person that crosses multiple jurisdictions. And this can mean lots of different things. It can mean that a crime took place on the reservation and a victim was taken off the reservation. It can mean a murder happened on or off tribal land that includes an Indigenous victim. And so when a tribal individual is moved from the scene of the crime, or when the crime takes place on tribal land, the number of actors involved in a case increases. And without formal agreements between tribal and state agencies, then there's a higher likelihood that information and data does not get shared, and it also increases the likelihood that there's lost evidence on these cases. And so the jurisdiction issues are when crime is committed by a non-tribal person on the reservation and the tribal police are the first to respond, or when a tribal member commits crime on a reservation and a non-tribal officer is the first to respond.
So turning to missing persons and policies, and before we get into the findings that we have pertaining to missing and murdered Indigenous persons, we want to set the stage a little bit for understanding missing persons cases and the responses to those cases. So first is recognition that there's this unique status of missing. So even though missing persons cases often involve police response, it is not a crime to go missing. So that puts the examination of missing persons cases into a slightly unique light compared to other types of interactions where we typically see police response and involvement. The level of police involvement and the procedures that are followed are going to depend on a number of factors, and we are going to touch on a couple of those very broadly. First, in terms of age, juveniles must be entered into NCIC within 2 hours of reporting. And so we have this mandate that makes age relevant. So when police receive report of a missing juvenile, that needs to be entered into that national system within 2 hours. There is not a similar federal time requirement for missing adults. So in terms of age, police agencies have discretion in regards to how quickly adults are entered into the system. Turning to circumstances, there are a variety of different circumstances that may influence response to missing persons. So again, going missing is not a crime, and if you are an adult, you do have the ability to voluntarily go missing or remove yourself from your current life. In addition, we might see missing persons in the context of natural disasters or accidents. And then we have categories of missing persons that are not voluntarily missing or not intentionally missing, including individuals who may be lured, experiencing human trafficking, domestic violence, kidnapping, wandering or elopement. That would be in cases of children that wander off, or individuals who may be experiencing dementia and may wander off. And then in terms of juveniles, we also see instances of running away, which may overlap in terms of the causes for running away with some of those previously mentioned factors like domestic violence or abuse. In addition to circumstances and age, the other component that may influence response are policies. So policies vary across agencies. Some agencies have policies for responding to both missing adults and missing children. Some agencies only have policies in terms of responding to missing children, and then other agencies do not have policies. We were able to determine that at least half of Idaho's agencies do have written missing persons policies that provide policy and procedures for responding to reports of both missing adults and missing children. But we also have departments operating in the state that have policies only for missing children, and we have departments that do not have a written policy. So we see this range in terms of the amount of discretion that might occur in responding to these cases across agencies in the state. Defining missing and perceptions of policies were also two of the areas that were explored in the stakeholder interviews. And so I'm going to turn it back to Mel real quick so she can share that information.
So missing was definitely a part of the scope of this project to understand some just preliminary data on missing. One of the things that I want to speak to is the need for an Indigenous centered and data practice to understand this, because this is one of the largest sort of differences between how administrative data defines missing and is defined in policies, and how Indigenous agencies and people, communities identify missing persons. And what's significant about this difference is our Indigenous people, we believe that our people, single individuals can embody our entire group of people. You know, when we share the story of who we are, when somebody says, who are you? That is a political question. It is, we embody our families, we embody our entire group of people. And so the distinction between how administrative data in missing persons cases identifies a missing person does differ from the definitions of how our community identifies and notifies and feels about missing persons cases. But we do want to understand that, like, the most common definition, the NCIC definition for missing person is categorized by age, person missing under circumstances not voluntary, a person of any age who's missing where they might be endangered, they might be missing due to catastrophe, a person who's missing that does not meet any of the criteria for juvenile, and then a person who might be missing that's over 21, who people have a reasonable concern for their safety. Perception of administration policies are, again, is complex because of, for two reasons. One is that agencies may not have a policy manual that clearly identifies a practice on missing persons cases. And some agencies really prefer to keep administrative discretion to investigate the circumstances of missing persons cases, particularly with reference to Fourth Amendment rights against unwanted search and seizure. Some agencies have extensive policy manuals that dictate every person should get entered into NCIC no matter the circumstances. And so something that our data was able to, the qualitative data was able to capture was just a multiplicity of Indigenous, non-tribal agencies and tribal and non-tribal agencies perspectives of missing and administrative policy preferences on missing persons cases.
So turning to the data. The time dimension of missing persons records and how data are collected is important to understand. So missing cases are dynamic. So someone could go missing and be found in the same day. So we see a lot of change over time, and this influences how we measure missing persons cases. So there are a variety of ways to look at missing persons data. You can look at a single point in time. So usually that's one day. So in one day, who are the missing persons? You can look at if you have either one day or multiple days, multiple points in time, you're able to look at missing persons as individuals across points in time, even though they may appear at multiple points in time. And we can also look at missing persons entries. And entries are distinct from individuals because one individual may go missing more than once. So an individual is a singular person, but if an individual goes missing multiple times, they may have multiple entries. So all of these different ways of how data can be represented for missing persons are important for context and understanding what it is that we find when we look at data. So for this report, we did two things. Oh, can you go back one second real quick? We did a point in time analysis, pulling missing persons cases from the Idaho Missing Persons Clearinghouse, NCMEC, and NamUs. So these are three publicly available sources for identifying active missing persons reports. So on 3 dates, we pulled all of the cases from those 3 different data sources in order to identify who the missing persons were on those 3 dates. This also means that we're able to look at the number of unique or individual missing persons across those 3 points in time. And then we separately were able to examine some summary statistics from NCIC. And these were summary statistics because NCIC is not a data set that is publicly accessible. Okay, next slide, please. Thank you. So this table here displays for you visually what some of that variation is in terms of the different ways that we can look at the data. So in terms of the 3 publicly available sources, the Clearinghouse, NCMEC, and NamUs, we can see that point in time data can be displayed to show variation across time points or even similarities across time points, as well as gives us the ability to calculate averages across points in time. And we can look at those unique individuals, since some individuals may be represented at multiple points in time. So in terms of the presentation today, we are really focusing on those last 2 columns that appear on the right. So what we're going to present for you is using information looking at the averages across time and looking at unique missing persons across time. And so here you can see those breakdowns as well as the indication of reports where race is marked as unknown. So those individuals we can't place in the context of this data. So when we look at these 3 sources in terms of focusing on race as they are identified in these reports, we see that Natives are disproportionately represented in comparison to their proportion in the population in the state of Idaho. And we also see that the rate of Native missing persons is higher than the state's overall rate, as well as being higher than the rates for other racial groups in the state. So just to back up a little bit in terms of understanding what exactly these 2 ways of presenting the data are and what they mean. So the chart that is on the left is comparing the proportion of the population by race to the proportion of missing persons in the population. And just like Patina Park referenced, what we can see here is indication of disproportionality or a disparity. So we see that though American Indian and Alaska Natives represent 2.45% of the population, they are on average represented in terms of missing persons at 4.4%. So we see them overrepresented in terms of missing persons reports. Turning to the right, to the graph on the right, it uses the same base information, so population by race, average number of missing persons by race, but it displays these data as rates. So rates provide a meaningful way for us to make comparisons across population groups of different sizes And for this instance, we're looking at population groups based on race. So we calculate rates by dividing the number of incidents, so in this case, missing persons, by the population of that group, and then multiplying it by 100,000. So this gives us the ability to compare, even though the population of white individuals in the state of Idaho is significantly higher than the population of American Indian, Alaska Natives. By calculating rates, we can engage in a comparison across those groups, taking that size difference into account. And in doing so, we see that American Indian and Alaska Natives in the state of Idaho have the highest rate of missing persons per 100,000 people. Okay. So turning back to some of the descriptive findings based on what we were able to pull from these 3 data sources. In these findings, we are comparing individuals who are identified as Native, so the unique individuals across the 3 time points, with those who are not identified as Native in those reports. So what we can see here is a distinction between when we're looking at the state as a whole, or when we're looking at non-Native missing persons. Based on these time points, we see a higher proportion of males who are represented in missing persons reports. For Native missing persons, we're seeing a higher proportion of females represented in those reports. Turning next to look at age, and we use this distinction of age to coincide with the requirements to put missing persons reports into NCIC. So in terms of age, we're comparing juveniles who are under 21 with adults who are 21 and over. For Native missing persons, we see an even split in age. For non-Native missing persons, we see that this is slightly different. So again, this comparison shows us that we have this more even split in these data between juveniles and adults. So indicating an importance of considering both juvenile and adult missing person cases. Another aspect that we can look at based on the information in the reports is the amount of time that folks may go missing. So splitting it at the 1 year mark, we see that a higher proportion of both Native and non-Native missing persons have been missing for more than 1 year. And this proportion is a little less among Native cases. It is possible that this could be influenced by the data. So persons who are missing for short periods of time may be reflected in NCIC, but they may not be missing long enough to have appeared in NamUs, for example, or if someone is reported missing and located very quickly, the manual process that the clearinghouse manager has to engage in to pull information from NCIC and put it into the clearinghouse might mean that we just may not capture as many of those short-term missing cases. Okay, so Mel mentioned earlier the Ncic categorizations, and that this gives us some indication of potentially some of the case circumstances or case characteristics. So the clearinghouse uses these record categorizations in order to display missing persons report on their website. So looking at that information for these data, we see that there's a higher proportion of Natives in disability records and juvenile records compared to non-Natives. And we see that the majority of Native missing persons appear overall in juvenile and other records. In regards to location, and primarily basing this on the jurisdiction of the missing persons cases, so looking at what agency was the contact agency representing the jurisdiction of that missing person, we were able to see comparing Native missing persons with missing persons overall in the state. that Native missing persons were primarily missing from 3 of Idaho's reservations or counties that were surrounding those reservations, and that some of the counties with missing Native persons also have the highest number of missing persons overall. Another aspect that's not depicted in that map, but that's relevant for thinking about policies and moving forward, is that among the Native missing persons, the contact agency was a tribal police department for 7 of those, but it was a city or a county agency for 5. And so this indicates 2 important points for us to consider. First, that not all Native missing persons are going to go missing from a tribal jurisdiction. And second, that not all Native missing persons may be members of one of Idaho's tribes. And we see that also reflected in the population, that there are more folks identifying as Indigenous that are living in spaces that aren't reservations versus on reservations in the state. And so we would expect to see that this would impact both urban Indigenous people as well as Indigenous people living on reservations. Okay, shifting gears to the NCIC data. So let's see, if you will go back 1 slide. We'll start here first. So with NCIC entries in Idaho, so keeping in mind that entries do not necessarily equate to individuals, because some individuals go missing multiple times. So this isn't a one-to-one with persons, but entries are relevant because that means that we are seeing a person regardless of the number of times. These are instances of missing. So what we can see from the pie chart on the top are the percentages of missing person entries by race using a 5-year average. So looking at 2016 through 2020, what do those breakdowns look like? So you can see American Indian and Alaska Native are 3.39%. And then also drawing your attention to the fact that 11% of those cases have or 11% of those entries, apologies, have an unknown race, which might be something for us to focus on in terms of really understanding the scope of the issue. The bottom chart displays the number of entries per year for American Indian and Alaska Natives. So again, we can see this variation between when we look at point in time data and we're looking at individuals or cases, and when we're looking at entries for an entire year and the difference that exists there. Looking at NCIC data also provides the opportunity to draw some comparisons between Idaho and the national level. So national NCIC summary data is released annually. So if we look at 2020, the most recent year that we have complete data on, we can see that even though we know there's going to be variations in terms of the national population and what the national population looks like versus what Idaho's population looks like, we do still see some potentially interesting differences in terms of the number of unknown race cases or race entries being higher, and the percent of entries for American Indian and Alaska Natives being higher in Idaho than it is at the national level. Okay, turning to NCIC entries and examining sex. We can see here that the proportion of entries for females who are identified as Native is a little bit higher than the proportion of entries for males identified as Native, and that this varies from what we see looking at non-Natives. For age, when we look at NCIC entries, we can see a difference from the point in time data. So the overwhelming majority of Native missing person entries are for juveniles. And this again could in part be due to the fact that juveniles are more likely to go missing more than once. And so we might see a higher level of entries representing juveniles, whereas when we look at a singular point in time, we might see more open missing cases pertaining to adults. Okay, so in some takeaway points from the missing persons data, both indicate higher proportion of female missing persons for natives. Half of native missing persons went missing as adults. The majority of NCIC entries are for juveniles. The proportion of cases and entries with unknown race poses some real challenges in terms of our ability to accurately assess scope. And these data represent missing persons cases that are reported to police. And so we have to keep in mind that those cases that aren't reported to police, or those cases where police use discretion to not add those cases into NCIC for whatever reason, aren't going to be reflected here. So there's still a piece of information out there that we don't have access to. And finally, having data fields for ethnicity and tribal affiliation, which we see in systems like NamUs, may also be beneficial to add to the clearinghouse's data fields. Okay, moving quickly to the homicide data. We were able to look at 3 data sets in order to try to get a picture of what homicide data look like. And the first is the Center for Disease Control and Prevention's Wander data set. These data are based on death certificates. The CDC does note that they may still represent an undercount, but looking at these data provides us with information on deaths that were attributable to assault, which is the closest comparison to what we would consider deaths that would be homicides. And based on death certificates, what do we see? So these data show that natives are disproportionately represented in deaths attributable to assault in Idaho, looking at the years 2010 to 2019. So we can see here, similar for what we looked at in terms of missing persons cases and race, that there is this disproportionate percentage of American Indian and Alaska Natives that are appearing in these deaths attributable to assault, and also a rate that is higher for American Indian and Alaska Natives than it is for whites in the state. Idaho's UCR program data are also publicly available. There's strong participation in this data from Idaho policing agencies. Idaho State Police collects this data, and they put out an annual Crime in Idaho report using policing data from across the state. It is important to note that tribal policing agencies usually don't submit their data through this system, but rather submit directly to the FBI. So we're going to see that data in a moment. The benefit of these data is that they do have detailed information on victims, not just suspects or offenders. So in these data, we see a smaller number as opposed to 20 deaths attributable to assault. We see that there were 6 homicide victims that were identified as American Indian or Alaska Native between the time period 2010 to 2019. Also important to note that there were 40 or 11% of the overall total that were identified with a race unknown in that same time period. So as I indicated, police departments have the option to submit data to a state collection or to submit directly to the FBI. Participating in UCR is voluntary. Not all police agencies participate in UCR across the country, but it does give us an opportunity to look at what the tribal police departments have been submitting at a national level. These data only represent homicides. They don't necessarily represent the victim and don't always include in the public facing data set indication of race of the victim or offender. But we do see that tribal police departments reported 20 homicides in this time period. And just also a note that not all agencies are included for each year. So homicide data, in summary, we see variation across sources, which makes it hard to determine the scope. The level of unknown race cases where the race is not identified is problematic in terms of having accurate counts. We do see evidence that tribal and non-tribal police are responding to and handling cases with Native victims. And the CDC data looking at deaths attributable to assault are a strong indication that Natives are disproportionately represented compared to their proportion in Idaho's population. And I'm going to turn it back over to Mel now.
So I think that there was a lot covered by Patina. She had excellent recommendations, and we, as Bernie called for earlier, as so many folks have called for earlier, the need for collaboration on these issues is so essential to answering, and data sharing and agreements really do impact the outcomes of these cases, and understanding or having a better sense of jurisdiction. Data sharing was such a huge and important issue. There are cases where we have unclear information that of cases not making or escalating up to through tribal court systems, because in the instance of there being no agreement and there is a non-native perpetrator and the county agency takes them, it's very unclear if tribal agencies have access to that data. And so it does not escalate up through the tribal court system. And so enhancing data sharing. We do have instances of agencies that do have agreements and who are actively working on this. And so we know that that has an impact for tribes that have those agreements in place. Another possible solution that was noted was we know that across Idaho, even in rural jurisdictions, many agencies do not have investigators with resources that work weekends. And we know that there is stories, and stories often indicate that the issues, obviously we know that these, missing and murdered Indigenous people does not recognize time. It definitely goes through the weekends, right? And so, solution is, bridging resources so that we can pool resources or offer overtime funding for law enforcement agencies who are being pulled in on missing and murdered cases, especially when they cross jurisdiction. I did want to focus on this. Of course, there's a lot of recommendations. You can read those in the report, but one area of that we need to understand better is the reason why there are so many racially unknown cases, and this has to do historically with data and everything that Patina has highlighted. But I did want to highlight one sort of area that should and needs work on is my area of expertise has been the urbanization of American Indian people and how that has been administratively kept in data. And these recommendations obviously overlap, especially with the need for data collaboration, but we also need to understand the historical legacy of American Indian and folks moving to urban areas. And that has been a history that has been long held in tension, even within Indigenous communities. And we know that cases like the Urban Indian Health Institute has been working with law enforcement data protocols to reduce unknown racial identification. This is rooted in the history of application of administrative data. When natives moved to the city, they often lost access to their identity, to resources, including representation in tribal justice systems. And American Indigenous identity is ethno-linguistically identified. And so again, when we are asked, who are you? I'm not gonna just tell somebody that I'm American Indian. That's not who I am. I am Hunkpapa Lakota. I am from Standing Rock Sioux Tribe of South Dakota. But to understand the story of how I got to Idaho as a Hunkpapa Lakota matters in the way that we capture this data. And so understanding that tribal data, even if we capture tribal data, tribes have Indigenous people from all over the country living on tribal jurisdiction as well. So they're not going to just identify with the tribal of the identity of the reservation they might be living on. They might be from a completely different tribe. And so it's important that these trends contribute to the notion that of why we have so many unidentified cases. And I did just want to highlight we do have what this data does not capture is the collaborations and the work of of community agencies working on collaborating currently. There's so much great work being done right now that this data does not capture. We did capture a little bit of it in the qualitative data, and I certainly tried to do justice to the work of our tribal domestic violence and our court systems who have been working with law enforcement agencies to reduce or to uplift the stories of those folks doing that work and who are doing the collaborative work. They are identifying the gaps with their own cases, identifying the gaps of service needs, educating people through the court system, through the investigation process. And we know that we have so much work to do in this area. I have opened, I tried to be open to families who need information in navigating these cases, especially when they cross jurisdiction. But we know that we have so much work to do to improve that. And, just recognizing that we do need, Patina called for Indigenous-led victim service support, and recognizing that so many of our tribal agencies work under grant funding that where the reality Patina highlighted is that they work under grants that only recognize a small scope of victimization or crime that's very identified very succinctly, and it's very difficult to provide services under the reporting that is required under grants. And so understanding that tribal service providers or victim service providers may often work under just domestic violence grants. They might just work under crime or criminal victims of crime grants. And those have very, very narrow applications, and they're very difficult to work with. And so, working to expand the funding and expanding the reporting requirements, lessening the burden for that for tribal domestic, and opening for an Indigenous centered healing is so critical. And that is what we have. And I really tried hard to get that down, but I know that as often conferences go long.
Hey, thank you, Sister Melanie. It was great to have you share this information. I'm just super proud of you because it was a year's worth of work. And you've really had to, I want to hold this for you, that you not only had to do this research, but you're researching your own people while holding your own trauma. That's hard. That's what makes this so difficult for so many of us, is we are survivors of violence. We are survivors who made it home. We have to read death certificates and missing persons reports. So there's just so much emotion that we carry as part of this work. Western colonizer models will have us believing we have to have a work-life balance. Indigenous people can't separate ourselves from this work.
I did want to mention one thing. Sorry, Ty, I'm going to put in, as you all know, I mentioned earlier, I am a second-year PhD student.
I was about to get to that.
Okay.
I got you. All right. So I want to make sure that we have room so I can get through the rest of these, to get through the rest of our folks today, but I've got you all covered for surveys and for things of that nature. So since we don't have a lot of room to answer the questions that we've received, my commitment is I will take your questions, keep these questions, answer them, share them with Melanie and Lane if they have a way of contributing via email. And these answers I can send out to all of the registrants and attendees that are here. So I'm just going to consolidate time in a couple of different ways. Melanie Filmore has dropped her email, so please reach out if there are things that you would like her to expand on. This survey is really, really important, right? This work is not the end. This report is not the end. It is the beginning of a much deeper dive, a much deeper look about how we can create services for Indigenous communities to address violence in Indian countries, specifically MMIWP. You're going to get this survey like 5 or 6 times. I'm going to drop it again before we end today. You've got it now. It will be in your browser when we end the webinar, and then I will send it again as part of our follow-up email at the end of our conference today. So please take what did you say, 15 minutes or so?
It's probably longer than 15 minutes, but this contributes not only just to my dissertation, but to the work of the the entire MMIP group in Idaho. It doesn't matter if you're from a different state, if you work on MMIP, please take the survey, let us know who. We're trying to gather information on who does that coordinating, who does the burden, takes on different parts of the burden of the policy work. And so my responsibility back to the tribal communities is to help develop response plans or whatever the tribes want in the future of this work. But in order to understand that, we need to understand how we understand the issue, who takes on the burden of what. And so please, I beg you, please consider participating in the survey so that we can continue the work and I can help the folks present to do their jobs in an efficient manner and make use of their time and resources that they are dedicating to that. So thank you.
Great. Yeah, thank you all so much for this. Like, this is, will have us as a resource. Like we said, we've said it at the beginning, I will say it again. The whole purpose of our time together is at some point we will get to a formalized Idaho-based MMIW task force that incorporates Bernie and the other executive directors of the tribal victim service providers, law enforcement stakeholders, our criminal legal system stakeholders, our community folks. I want to shout out all of the grassroots organizers who have joined this conference today. We could not be doing this work if it were not for you. I will underscore that. No work to end violence in Indian country happens without survivors, survivor families, and these community folks. So I want to celebrate y'all for being here. Melanie and Lane, thank you so much. I am going to put out another poll for y'all as we bring Tanea to the front to speak to the Idaho State Police Missing Persons Clearinghouse. So I'm going to launch this really quick. It'll be about a minute live. So this is just asking, what resources do you all need to better address MMIP in your communities? It's very abridged. It's very, truncated. Like, we know that there are huge gaps, but this really does help us to improve how we prioritize what resources we have, how we prioritize sharing knowledge with y'all. So please, please drop your answers into this poll. It helps me out. I like very high level data. Of course, Melanie gave you the nitty gritty. We're about 20 seconds out. Thank you so much. Your participation is great in this. Workshops for MMIWP resources. That's one that capacity building and knowledge base, like that's also one. Of course, then that comes, like that gives us room to, dive deep into some of these high level principles we've been talking about today. Awesome. So I'm going to give you that about 10 more seconds. All right. And then just a reminder, we've dropped the full report that was published out of the Idaho Council on Domestic Violence and Victim Assistance that celebrates and highlights Melanie and Lane's work. So please use that chat. I will also send that as a follow-up resource at the close of our time together. So just a real quick look about where we're at around needs. Thank you for responding and letting us know how we can show up for you. This helps with some of our regional efforts as well. We just want to make sure that we are serving the stated needs of folks doing this work in community. So I appreciate you. Tanea, it is good to see you. It's been like 2.5 years since I've seen you in person. I'm going to go ahead and let you introduce yourself and take us away.
Thanks, Ty. I appreciate that. And thank you for asking me to participate in today's event. I'm sorry we're doing it virtually again, but I do have the time scheduled in May. I already have it on my calendar to block off to make sure that I'll be there for the in-person conference. I'm Tanea Parmenter with the Idaho State Police Missing Person Clearinghouse, and I appreciate Melanie and Lane before did an amazing job on their report, and I was happy with their findings and their deep research. I'm just going to talk to you today about what is the Missing Person Clearinghouse and some common misconceptions about missing person cases, and then leave some room for some questions. So the Missing Person Clearinghouse was established in 1999, and it's really a central location for resources and identification on missing persons and it's really helped assist national and regional efforts for Idaho's missing. And what do we consider a missing person? Well, at the clearinghouse, a missing person is somebody whose whereabouts are unknown, either to a parent, caretaker, or others who have normal contact with that person. So it doesn't necessarily have to be a family member to report that person missing. If you have normal contact with maybe a friend or somebody you know who is no longer responding to communication or is missing, you are able to report that person as missing. And what is the clearinghouse roles? Well, we do quite a few things, and I say it's actually just myself. I only have one person in the clearinghouse to manage all of the needs for Idaho. And when I say Idaho, I mean everybody in Idaho, whether it's a tribal nation, state, federal, or local agencies. Idaho encompasses, everybody in our state. So we maintain a database of the Idaho's missing. We verify our NCIC entries. That's how I'm made aware of any missing persons in Idaho. So as soon as an entry is entered into NCIC, then I can receive that notification. I put them on the database. I can put them on Facebook, social media, and through the distribution as needed by the agency. We do have a toll-free hotline that's not manned. It's for voicemail only for tips. And we are the state link for NCMEC, which is the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, and NAMIS, which is the national database. It was really kind of designed a lot for adult missing, because we had the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children when we needed a nexus for adult missing, and other national databases. We do have the website online where it has all of our missing that's been entered into NCIC. And please remember, with the website, it is updated only Monday through Friday during business hours. So if somebody goes missing in the middle of the night, it'll be updated the next day. Social media and notification systems, those are updated when we have an endangered missing person or a higher need for the community to be looking for a particular missing person or child. So we have our different notification systems. I do training for law enforcement on missing person response. So the initial response, help develop model policies and procedures for law enforcement so they know how to respond to missing persons. I help research and find fingerprint cards. Our Bureau of Criminal Identification, which the Missing Person Clearinghouse is housed under, we handle all the fingerprint cards for the state of Idaho. So I will get with that team to find any fingerprint cards for these missing person records. I assist the law enforcement agency with collection on DNA and dental records so that we can make sure that we're having a full packed record of that missing individual for identification. Hague Convention requests. So when a person or a parent takes a child outside of their country and comes into the United States, the State Department reaches out to the Missing Person Clearinghouse in that state where they believe that taking parent is, to help do things like employment searches, utility searches, surveillance if needed, to make sure that that taking parent and child are there. We're not able to recover the child, but what we do is we let the State Department know they're able to send agents to help serve paperwork to go through the litigation process of custody and abduction if needed. Every week I send a report to the vital statistics to flag birth certificates. And the reason we do that is, and these are just on juveniles. So if a person goes missing and our child goes missing, and that taking parent or taking person needs that birth certificate to enroll them in school, daycare, or need other resources to get resources for that child. If they ask for the original birth certificate from Vital Records or a copy of that birth certificate and it's flagged, Vital Records will notify me, and then I will notify the agency, and we can find that child quicker because there is a return of address that they have to send that birth certificate to. You compile statistics on these missing person records, and a lot of the things that we've talked about before with Melanie and Lane is needing more data collection, and I completely agree. The statistics that I compile is everything that's been entered into NCIC, but I would love to see a more robust data collection on these missing person records, as far as, you know, they're a tribal member or where they're enrolled at. NAMUS does have a spot to put that in their missing person records. I have like a note section that I can put it in ours if it's made aware to me, but there's more information that we need to compile on this, on our missing persons, because we really can't manage until we can measure what's going on. I provide resources to law enforcement and families. We do have some resources as far as what happens when your child runs away, documentation on that. Law enforcement resources are, you know, who has canines, who has search information or search resources and volunteers. And so when a child or a person goes missing and they need additional resources or help, I can help direct them to those areas. And then a case analysis upon request, and that's upon request from law enforcement. So if the case has gone long term, I compile all the tips and everything, and we can do an analysis and a case study on it to make sure it gets some new fresh eyes, that we're not missing something. When an investigator's been working a case for a long period of time, sometimes things either can be overlooked or it may not show up right away. So having a fresh set of eyes on cases is useful when helping look for these missing, long-term missing. So how a flow of a missing persons report happens. Family reports to law enforcement or friend reports to law enforcement that their family member is missing. Law enforcement then takes that report and enters that person into NCIC. And then once it's entered into NCIC, the missing person clearinghouse receives that and distributes that out. The reason I have an asterisk next to the first one where family reports to law enforcement, I was doing some meetings on helping tribal nations become ready for an Amber Alert. So we're able to issue out an Amber Alert. And there's a big push right now with the Ashland Mike Act Amber Alert in Indian Country. And I was talking to them about, you know, how they receive these intakes of reports and, you know, how they activate all the way through investigation. And I was finding out that family doesn't necessarily always report to the law enforcement agencies. Sometimes they report to other members in the community, like council members, or somebody who they hold in high regard. So we need to make sure that when we're looking at the response to missing persons case in tribal nations, that we need to make sure that we include everybody, not just law enforcement, but every member of the community that may get a report of a missing person, and what do they do with that report, and how do they push that on so that there's some activation or some movement on that case. And then the third bullet, where missing person receives into NCIC and we start the distribution process, that really depends on which agency's entering it in. So all law enforcement, including tribal law enforcement, state, federal, and local law enforcement, have access to NCIC in Idaho. And they have what we call an ORI, it's an identifying number. And if that ORI is maybe at the FBI level, where maybe an FBI case is taking over a case that's happened on tribal lands or BIA, if they entered under their ORI, I may not see it because I only see Idaho originating numbers. So one thing that I would like law enforcement to do, or, you know, even if the family wanted to, is once they report that person missing, they can go out to our website, you know, within 24 hours and see if that person that they reported missing is on there. And if not, please get a hold of me so that I can reach out to that agency and make sure that I'm capturing that data, so that if it's happening at a different level, BIA or federal, that I can still capture that missing person report and get them onto our website. Some common misconceptions, and I want to clarify some of these misconceptions when I've traveled across the state and done training, and also heard back from family members or people close to the case. I've heard some really interesting things that pop up, and I think it's just a knowledge or awareness to law enforcement that and the community member that there is no waiting period to report a missing person. We see that on TV where it's like, oh, you have to wait 24 hours. And I wish I knew where that started from, but in Idaho, there's no waiting period to report a person missing, adult or juvenile. They can report within an hour, 2 hours. And my recommendation is always to report as soon as possible, because I know from working with law enforcement that we would rather delete somebody out and find them right away than maybe be behind the ball already, and a day or two behind the ball and not know that that person's missing and waste time, or having to backtrack on time and we're already behind the schedule. So there is no waiting period to report a person missing. If you have problems where your community has reported that person missing, and maybe that you've been given pushback on that, just let them know, especially a person under the age of 21, they're federally required to enter them into NCIC within 2 hours. And so if you're having any issues with that, you can reach out to the clearinghouse, and we can't force agencies to act on a missing person case, but we can probably provide some other resources. Anyone can file a missing person report, and I talked about that earlier. And then the jurisdiction, that can be really sticky. And as far as Melanie and Lane came up with on their report, they saw how jurisdiction plays a huge issue in missing person cases. Not everybody is reported missing on tribal nations, and then that's entered through there. What we're seeing is people are moving around the country. We have more access to movement. We have more access to being able to live in other areas. And so let's say you have a child that is in college, and they go away to another state to college, and you can't get a hold of your child, and they're not responding to texts or phone calls, and you're really worried about it. And who do you report that child as missing? Do you report it to your local police department, or do you report it to the local police department where that child's missing from school? Right now, there is no jurisdiction as far as if you report it to your local law enforcement agency, they're obligated to take that report, enter that person in as missing, and start that case. And if they need to, they can liaison with that other jurisdiction where that child was last seen or that person was last seen to transfer that case over to them and work that case there. It really takes a lot of effort, and we need to make sure that we're staying on top of that law enforcement is working with those other jurisdictions and having that good communication. And the clearinghouse can help liaison some of that communication, whether finding the contact information or finding who handles that, or getting public records requests for those other states. Another misconception is runaways, and it's really a mindset that needs to shift. Just because a child goes away voluntarily does not necessarily mean that they're not missing. In fact, they're considered one of our most endangered missing because they're putting themselves out there into put in a position where they have a higher chance of being trafficked. They have a higher chance of ending up with somebody who wants to hurt them or can hurt them. Drugs can be involved, gang involvement. So I always, when training law enforcement, let them know that really focus on your runaway missing child cases. And the reason you want to do that is because, one, you're going to find other elements of crime, but two is they are more endangered. They don't have the ability to go out and take care of themselves. They think, and most of them can or try to figure it out, but they have a higher endangerment factor. And we really need to do what we call a social autopsy on these kids. So when a child goes missing and maybe they have ran away and came back multiple times, we need to figure out what's making them leave the home, either pushing them out of the home or making them lured out of the home. So is somebody pulling them from the home because they're luring them, or is somebody pushing them out of home? Maybe there's sexual abuse or anything like that. But we need to ask those questions when that child comes back of what's going on, how can we help you, what resources do you need, and why do you keep running away? What's the situation? And then, of course, I talked about the mandatory reporting of persons under the age of 21. So when we talk about mandatory reporting, there's two types of mandatory reporting. The first is NCIC. Under the age of 21 has to be entered into NCIC within 2 hours, and especially children missing from care. So there was a law passed a few years ago that any child missing from care, like either foster care or guardianship, they need to make sure that they are being reported to law enforcement, whether it's the social worker or the guardian or the foster care parent, person. They need to report that right away as soon as that child goes missing from care. And not only do they have to report it to law enforcement, but they have to report it to the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children within 24 hours. So that foster care or that conservative or whoever has guardianship over that child must report to law enforcement and the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. And then with the Adam Walsh Act, any person under the age of 21 needs to be reported to NCMEC as soon as possible. So whether that's law enforcement reporting it or the parent, and I recommend both. I think both law enforcement needs to call NCMEC because they provide a ton of resources for law enforcement, including forensic services, and also for the parent. So they have resources for the parent. And I'll talk about that a little bit later on. And family and law enforcement, again, like I said, anybody that has information on that child should be calling the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. So just some of the best practices, and there's a lot of best practices, and especially when I do my training, it's a full day of training, but I just took a few things that I really want to focus on for best practices for law enforcement. It's making sure that every person that is reported missing, adult or child, is entered into NCIC. It doesn't hurt to enter them in, and it actually helps us understand how many people are reported missing, because we can track that information. And packing that NCIC record, so making sure that we have the vehicle attached to that record, we have the plate, we have the social security number, we have fingerprints and dental and photos. Photos are huge in these NCIC records. I can't tell you how many I see that don't have a photo attached. And if we can't give the public somebody to look for, it really doesn't do any good for us to push out that notification of that missing person. And so photos are super important, and the right photo. If you have a child that has their school picture and their hair's done up and they're in a nice dress and everything, that's a great picture, yes, but we would rather have the day-to-day picture of that child where they're in their normal environment and has their different pose, because it's something that they would probably see out in the world rather than that child dressed up for their school photo or any other type of photo that may not reflect that person every day. And then delayed travelers, I'm seeing this one come up quite often, where a person reports saying, hey, I have a family member that's traveling into our state. They haven't responded. They're 5 hours late. I need to report a delayed traveler. That's considered a missing person. Their whereabouts are unknown. So we need to enter those delayed travelers into NCIC. And the reason for that is because we enter that vehicle. And if any other law enforcement in the nation comes across that vehicle or that person, they will know that that person is a delayed traveler and that people are looking for them. And then a big one is appointing a family liaison to work with your families during a missing person case. This will help with your communication. I do hear a lot, we do our family roundtables, that families feel that there is not enough communication with law enforcement. They don't know what's going on. They feel like maybe law enforcement isn't doing anything about it because they can't see everything that's happening behind the scenes. So have a family liaison to work with that family to foster that communication between law enforcement and that family, and keep them updated on the process. Let them know, hey, you know, this is where we're at. You don't have to give specific details, but just say, we've done this many tips that we've looked at. We've, you know, interviewed so many people. You know, we're still working this case. It's still important to us, and letting that communication with that family so that they don't feel like they are left out of the loop. Families want to help in cases. They want to make sure that they have a voice and they want to help. And so if you are enabling them to maybe pass out posters or get that communication out, you're helping them so that they don't feel like there's nothing that they can do and they're just sitting there useless. Asking questions determine endangerment factor. There's been many times where I've worked cases and they've asked me to do an Amber Alert, and I say, well, what type of endangerment do we have? What imminent danger to bodily harm or death? And they're like, well, I don't know. And I'm like, well, do they have a medical condition? Well, I don't know. Do they have a mental health condition? I don't know. So we need to make sure that we're asking all of those endangerment factors. Is there a mental health issue? Is there a medical? If they don't have the medicine within the next 4 hours, will they, you know, have a seizure or into diabetic shock or something like that? So we need to ask all of those endangerment factors. And sometimes families don't recognize that as something that they need to tell law enforcement because they deal with that every single day with that family member. So not on the forefront that it could be important. So we need to bring that out of them and ask those questions. And then again, that social autopsy of that missing child. Why are they leaving? Why are they disappearing? And where could they be going, or who could they be hanging out with? And some best practices for families too, or people that are reporting your missing persons. Make sure you're reporting it right away. I know the first thing when a child goes missing that you want to do is look for that child and want to see what's going on, but it's okay to call, report that the child's missing, and then start looking, because we'd rather have the law enforcement get out there as soon as possible. And we're fine with, if you are right in the middle, we're right in the middle of responding and you find that child, great, calling cancels will roll back, because that's a lot easier than having to go 2-3 days or longer trying to search for that child. Understanding who to report ahead of time, and that goes back to that information that I found out. You know, are you reporting to your council members, or are you reporting to law enforcement? And it's fine whoever you want to report to, but find out what's the best practice of doing that. And in that it's being reported to council members, are they reporting it to law enforcement? Gather all your information on your missing person that you can. Law enforcement's going to need photos. They're going to need possible direction of travel, people they hang out with, vehicles that they're driving, any type of devices. If they have a cell phone or a tablet or anything that is connected to the internet can help us locate missing child or missing person. And again, articulating those endangerments to law enforcement. Some resources for both law enforcement and for families, especially the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. They have great resources for family. They have Team Hope, which is the members of family members that have done this before. A couple members of Team Hope that I'm really good friends with, you know, calling Nick, her daughter was abducted at 6 years old. She's there to provide resources and peer support if another person goes missing, if your family member goes missing. Family law and case support. And then for law enforcement, they have Team Adam. So if you are a small law enforcement agency that may not have a large police presence or may not have the bodies to help do missing child cases, Team Adam will help send somebody out at no cost to the agency. It provides resources and bodies, and they're professionals. They have done this for many years. They're retired law enforcement. They have seen it all. They know how to search disposal sites. They know how to search dumpsters. They know how to do a lot of different things. So use them as a resource, even if it's just bouncing ideas off of. They do case analysis and forensics and help set up your checklist and SOP process. NamUs is a great resource because it allows family members to report those long-term missing cases. So if a family goes out and puts in or a person goes out and puts in a person missing, and I'm sure Jessica will talk about this, NamUs will reach out to that law enforcement agency, see if a case has been started. They'll also reach out to the clearinghouse and we can help search on that as well and help get that ball rolling as well. But number one, you should report to law enforcement. And if you don't feel comfortable, you can enter that missing person to NamUs. In Idaho, I'm currently establishing a child abduction response team, and we're trying to get a multi-jurisdictional, multidisciplinary team going so that we can respond quickly. And of course, we have our Amber Alerts and endangered missing person alerts, and then we do have training for community and law enforcement at ncjtc.org, which is the Department of Justice, provides a lot of training on that. I will send this information to Ty if she wants to distribute out, but here's our contact information for Coeur. Sign up at Code Red to receive my notifications, Facebook, Twitter, and our website on how you'll get missing persons. So just some conclusions on this. I think if we continue to collaborate and make sure that our processes are set up ahead of time and we have a standard set of process that we can help recover our missing persons quickly. And also we need to make sure that we have that data collection. And so that would be something that I'm very interested in going forward, is seeing how we can collect more data and how we can make sure that it's victim-centered data so that we know that we have the appropriate information. And I'll stay for any questions. And here's my contact information if you need any follow-up. You're muted, Ty.
Like 2 years into this now. Hey, thank you so much, Shania. It was good to have you, and this information is always useful for these interagency, interdisciplinary gatherings. I'm hearing, so unfortunately, I can't take questions. I'm going to clip us along. So a couple of things. One, yes, I will share all of the presenter contact information as part of my follow-up email to our conference today, including Tanea's. And the slides and resources, did I hear you say you're going to make those available, Tanea? Okay,
yeah,
so
I'll send them to you.
Perfect. And then last piece, there's a couple of things I'll synthesize as we're moving Jessica to the front from NamUs, which is useful. We'll move Jessica to the front and then switch some speakers around. We talk a lot about training, right? That like there's training available from the law enforcement side to communities who are missing their people. But what I would love all of you all to take away from today is that there's also training available from the Indigenous community side to law enforcement. There is a reason why there is a disconnect, animosity, apprehension of Indigenous people working with law enforcement officers. And I know I've provided that training before, that training and guidance for law enforcement agencies. Like, this is how best you can connect to Indigenous folks. This is how they need to be communicated with. This is what makes us what makes us comfortable. So there's an opportunity here for a lot of collaboration, and why we keep talking about collaboration and why we keep talking about interagency partnerships is because there's a lot of missing gaps in knowledge that we're just trying to place in all of the right places to interrupt this violence. There was a question that came through for Tanea from one of our community organizers around MMIP when around time limits. I will post that to Tanea so that she may be able to answer it for you in the chat. But I hear that you're right. You're not the only one to give us that feedback, Walina, that while you hear one thing from a law enforcement official, what's actually happening in the field, what's actually happening at a grassroots level, that's where some more of these disconnects are taking place. So take a deep breath and reset us. I am happy to bring Jessica Hager to the front to discuss NamUs. I always get this acronym wrong. National Missing Persons. There's a system in there. Oh my goodness. I say NamUs. I'm just accustomed to the acronym. But Jessica was also part of our conference last year and was able to provide some useful information about the way that system works. I want to reset some time for folks. We are about 15 minutes behind. I'm a decolonizer of time, but I want to be transparent with you all and know that we're giving you a lot of information in a short window. I certainly appreciate your patience. I certainly appreciate your willingness to stay through to the end. And then look for all of these resources and contact information so we can stay in touch. Jessica, I'll allow you to introduce yourself and get us going. Thank you so much.
Hi there, everyone. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you perfect.
Okay, thank you, Ty. And hello, everyone. Thank you for having me here today to talk about the NamUs program. And Ty was close. It's the National Missing and Unidentified Person System. So my name is Jessica Hager. I'm the Regional Program Specialist for NamUs for Region 2, which covers the state of Idaho, but also includes Minnesota, North Dakota, South Dakota, Montana, Wyoming, Washington, Oregon, and Alaska. So NamUs is a National Institute of Justice program managed through a contractual agreement with RTI International. And just a quick disclaimer that the content of today's presentation was created by myself. So any opinions, findings, conclusions, or recommendations expressed today are my own and do not necessarily reflect those of the National Institute of Justice. So for those of you who may not be as familiar with NamUs, it is a national information clearinghouse and resource center for missing, unidentified, unclaimed, and unclaimed person cases across the United States. All of the NamUs resources are provided at no cost to law enforcement, medical examiners, coroners, allied forensic professionals, and the family members of missing persons. So our mission at NamUs and our hope is that by bringing people, information, the sciences, and technology together, that we can help resolve more missing, unidentified, and unclaimed person cases throughout the United States. And we hope to do that through our core services, which include our nationwide information clearinghouse, our free of charge forensic services and investigative support, and then also offering training and outreach, just doing events and webinars like this, as well as various training events across the country to make sure people know what NamUs is and the resources that we have to offer. So for time purposes, I'm going to be focusing most of my presentation today on the missing person side of the database. And then later I want to go over the tribal data fields and the information that we're seeing in NamUs. But I just wanted to make a quick note on our forensic and analytical services. I mentioned that NamUs is managed through a contractual agreement with RTI International. And this contract was just awarded in April of 2021. And then we just fully transitioned to RTI on October 1st, so just a couple weeks ago now. So with this comes new plans to strengthen our forensic services. We are available immediately to accept and assist with odontology, fingerprint, and analytical requests. And then RTI is currently negotiating subcontracts with various DNA labs for DNA services, which hopefully we'll be able to announce soon. Of course, we want all of our missing loved ones to come home safe and to be okay, but we do recommend to the families that we work with and the law enforcement agencies that we work with to get these forensic biometrics on file. So should they be needed, they're available. But if anybody has questions about these services, since I'm not gonna be able to go into too much depth on those today, just reach out to me after the presentation. I can answer those questions. So who can use NamUs? Actually, anyone can use NamUs, and that's what makes this program so great and what makes us different from other law enforcement programs. Is not only do law enforcement personnel and the medical legal community have access to NamUs, but also the families and friends of the missing, victim advocates, and even the general public can enter cases, see cases in the system, and then be more involved with the cases. And honestly, that's just Such a powerful tool, especially for the families who want to help locate their loved one. I've talked to so many families over the years, and when their loved one goes missing, really all they want is a job to do. They want to help, bring their loved one home, and they want to be involved in their case. And NamUs gives them the opportunity to do that. So the NamUs database is typically the first experience most users have with the NamUs program. So today I'm going to make sure that you know how to find the website, how to register, how to enter a case, and then how to use our advanced search features. And one of the great aspects of NamUs is that it has created one central online repository where agencies, families, and concerned citizens can all participate in resolving cases. And although the NamUs database is searchable by anyone, sensitive case data is locked and can only be viewed by registered and vetted criminal justice personnel. And I like to point this out because as family, when you're entering your loved one, you're likely providing information like dates of birth, possibly medical history, mental health information, or even criminal history. And that information will not be seen by the public, but only criminal justice users who are vetted access to secure data. So anyone can explore NamUs without registering for the system by visiting our main page at www.namus.gov. But there really are benefits to registering for a NamUs account. So public users are family members of missing persons, there's volunteers, staff from missing person advocacy groups, and even the general public. So for public, registering allows you to make primary entry of a missing person into NamUs. It also allows you to track cases and search and view all publicly visible information in the NamUs case file. Professional users, such as local, state, federal, or tribal law enforcement officers, can register for professional access to the system, which will allow them to see information restricted to criminal justice users, such as dental radiographs, those fingerprint cards, or any other case-sensitive information in the system. In registering as a professional user, if there is any law enforcement on the line, you will need to enter a sponsor. So this is typically your direct supervisor, someone that can verify that you are who you say you are and that you work for the agency that you say you work for. And this just goes back to that protection of sensitive information. So to register, you can visit namus.gov/registration, and then you will select the user type. So for public users, I'll just walk you through quickly. It's pretty standard process. You'll provide a login email, password, security question, provide some basic contact information about yourself, and then accept the privacy policy and terms of use. And then you'll be sent an email to activate your account, and then you'll be ready to go. So once registered and logged into NamUs, you'll find that the system is very simple to use. Users will be taken to a central dashboard that contains all of their NamUs tools all in one place. So from this dashboard, you can find our advanced search tools. You can also view any cases that you've entered or that you are tracking. And this is also where you'll be able to enter a new case, which you can do so by clicking Add Missing Case on the top right corner of the screen. So after clicking the link to enter a new case, users are taken to a simple short entry form where they can provide basic information about their missing person to create a draft case in NamUs. And you'll see that there's a gray box on the top right of the screen. You'll find there some tips to, create and submit a missing person case. And then once you've entered your basic information, you'll be able to click Create Draft on the bottom of the screen. So once the draft is created, you'll be taken to the full case file where you can continue to enter information on your missing person. The system will also guide you to enter the minimum information required to submit the case to NamUs. And you'll see the orange boxes on the top of the screen. By clicking on those, it will direct you to what information is still required. And we recommend, even if it's not a required field, to enter as much information as possible on your missing person. This may help to bring in leads or generate proposed matches in the system. And also, I want to point out that anyone can enter a missing person into the NamUs database. So that includes family members and friends and the general public. But all cases must have a missing person report filed with law enforcement, and we need permission from the investigating agency to publish that case on the website for public viewing. But if you don't have a missing person report and you enter the case, that's fine. I'll reach out to you. I can answer any questions you have. I can even act as a liaison between you and a law enforcement agency to see if that report can be filed. It will just remain in pending status until we do get that missing person report filed. But once published, it is viewable to the public. And then if any leads or information come in on the case, I will forward those to the investigating agency for their review and any necessary follow-up. So I won't go through every portion of the case file, but you'll see that there is a section for every piece of information that should be collected for a missing person, from circumstances of disappearance to demographics to any unique physical or medical characteristics. Here you will see that you have the option to add if your missing person has any tattoos or scars, or to note what clothing they were last known to be wearing. There's also a section to note medical information. So have they had any prior surgeries, any past broken bones, medical implants, those kind of things. This can be very helpful for forensic identification should that be needed. And then there's also sections of NamUs dedicated to the storage of biometrics. So that's those dental records, fingerprint cards, or the availability of DNA profiles and CODIS. So these are all private sections in NamUs, but when you create a case as a family member or a victim advocate, if you know that that person has been fingerprinted, or if you know their last known dentist, you can enter that information at case entry, and then that will direct me to follow up with the investigating agency to see if I can get those records entered into NamUs. So NamUs also allows for the upload of any type of image, from facial photos of the missing to photos of tattoos, photos of commonly worn jewelry, clothing they were last known to be wearing, or the vehicle they were last known to be driving. All of these types of images can be added to a case file to enhance the case and possibly bring in more leads. And you'll notice the badge icon on some of the photos. That indicates that this is marked for professional view only. So private documents typically include those fingerprint records, dental records, or other information that the investigating agency may not want listed as publicly viewable. So in addition to serving as a central repository for case information, there's also an advanced search feature which allows searching of any field in the NamUs database to develop potential matches between missing and unidentified persons. So keep that in mind when you are entering your missing person. The more information that you have and provide in their case entry, the more likely that it could show up in another user's search results. So users can search for matches based on geography, unique physical descriptors like scars and tattoos, or even clothing, jewelry, and accessories. You know, we've had public users report tips that have connected cases because of something as simple as a backpack or a pair of shoes. You just never know what's going to stick out to another person. So after performing a search, you can view your results in a simple list view. You can also switch to a gallery view, which displays thumbnail pictures of missing or unidentified persons. And then finally, you can view your results in a map view. And all cases have a hyperlink within all three views, so you can pull up the full case file and continue to read additional information in that case. So now I want to take the next few slides to talk about the tribal data fields in NamUs. So when you are entering a case into NamUs, you'll see the tribal data fields that are available to provide information. And I'm sure many of you are aware of heard of Savannah's Act. In 2017, the then Senator Heidi Heitkamp of North Dakota introduced a bill for Savannah's Act named after the 22-year-old Spirit Lake tribewoman who was 8 months pregnant when she was murdered by her neighbor. So the purpose of the bill was to increase coordination among all levels of law enforcement, to increase data collection and information sharing, and then to empower tribal governments with the resources they need on cases involving missing and murdered Indigenous persons. So recognizing our potential to be a part of the increased data collection, the National Institute of Justice launched an update of NamUs. And this was back in December 2018. to add tribal data fields to missing and identified person cases. So these updates were made in collaboration with the Bureau of Indian Affairs and based on feedback from tribal leaders who wanted better tools to track members of their tribe who go missing. So the update to NamUs now allows users to indicate if a missing person is enrolled in or affiliated with a state or federally recognized tribe. So if the race or ethnicity of a missing person is noted to be American Indian or Alaska Native, their tribal enrollment or affiliation can be added through the 4-step process shown on the screen. So once it's noted that the tribe is state or federally recognized, users then can select from a pre-populated list of tribes based on the state. So once this data is entered, it's visible within the demographics section of the NamUs case file. But once the case is published, this information is only viewable to NamUs staff and the investigating agencies attached to the NamUs case file. However, these fields allow NamUs to provide aggregated statistics on tribal cases. So another field that was added in the 2018 upgrade of NamUs was the ability to note if a person went missing from tribal land or if their primary residence was on tribal land. And then similarly on the unidentified decedent cases, it can be noted if their remains were found on tribal land. So these are the numbers we're seeing in regards to the tribal data fields as of August 1st. So keep in mind that the data excludes cases where no related tribal information has been entered into NamUs. So when the tribal data fields were added, the system did not automatically update these fields on cases that were previously entered into NamUs. So we're having to work with the agencies or the families to go back and get those fields updated. But this is what we have in the system so far. So for missing from tribal land, 77% of the cases indicate the person is not missing from tribal land, and 13% are missing from tribal land. And then we have 10% that is unknown. And then we're seeing that 80% of the cases note that the missing person does not reside on tribal land, and 11% do reside on tribal land, and then 9% is unknown. And then regarding tribal enrollment and affiliation, we have that 72% of the cases are marked that this information is unknown, and 25% are listed as being enrolled or affiliated with a tribe. And then lastly, we have listed that 7% of these cases are being investigated by a tribal agency, and then 93% it's a non-tribal agency. And then on the unidentified person side, we're seeing that with 72% of the cases, remains are not found on tribal land, and 9% of the cases remains were found on tribal land. And we also have that 96% of the unidentified cases, the investigating agency is non-tribal. Most of the unidentified cases in NamUs are entered by medical examiners or coroner's offices, so we don't always have law enforcement agencies attached. So this is pretty typical on the unidentified side. But again, as we continue to get more cases in the system and update the cases we already have, we'll continue to get a clearer picture of this data. And I apologize, these numbers are somewhat outdated, but I did want to show that due to a large part to outreach efforts and data import projects between NamUs and agencies such as the Alaska Missing Person Clearinghouse and the New Mexico Department of Public Safety, we have seen a significant increase of the number of long-term missing Indigenous person cases being entered into NamUs. So between March of last year and September of last year, almost 200 new case entries were published in NamUs for long-term missing Indigenous persons. And our current numbers, as of just this week, show that we have 748 published cases. So we're seeing this number continue to increase. And we know we don't have every case though, and that's why we continue to do events like this, making sure people know about NamUs, and that by working together, we can hopefully see that number continue to rise. These efforts will allow NamUs to provide better statistics on the number of missing Indigenous persons, and ensuring that every missing Indigenous person is entered into NamUs. We are also ensuring that every available resource is dedicated to finding answers for those searching families and bringing their missing loved ones home. So just to break the numbers down a little further, these are the numbers we have in the system as of August 1st, 2021. So these are the numbers from our monthly reports, which you can find on the NamUs website. So as of August 1st, we had 734 published missing person cases that have been listed as American Indian or Alaska Native from 36 different states. So Alaska does have the highest number of published cases in NamUs with 292. And I mentioned on the previous slide that we did a data import with the Alaska State Missing Person Clearinghouse, and we entered around 700 long-term cases into NamUs at that time. Alaska does have a much higher rate of Indigenous persons than the US average, so it's expected that they have a higher rate of Indigenous missing persons than any other state as well. And then Oklahoma follows Alaska with 79, followed by Arizona, New Mexico, and Washington. So, and then it says from Idaho, we have 6, but it sounds like there might be people on the call from all over. So if you're looking at your state and that number doesn't sound right to you, I urge you to look at the database after we're done today and see what cases we have listed. And if you know someone who is missing and not on our list, whether you're family or concerned citizen, or if there's law enforcement on the line, please reach out to me and I can help to see if we can get that case entered. And then to break these numbers down a little more, the top graph shows the missing person cases by length of case. And we're seeing that 86% of the cases involving American Indian or Alaska Natives, the person was missing for longer than 1 year. And this runs pretty consistent with the overall cases that we have in NamUs. We primarily receive reports of long-term missing persons with around 95% of the cases having been missing for more than 1 year. And then the bottom graph shows the breakdown of sex and age. The person went missing. Currently in NamUs, we have that 69% of the cases are male and 31% are female. And in over 50% of the cases, the person went missing between the ages of 21 and 40. And finally, on the unidentified side, currently we have 162 published unidentified person cases that have been listed as American Indian or Alaska Native from 28 different states. And you'll see the highest number of cases is out of Arizona with 36, followed by California, Oklahoma, Alaska, and New Mexico. And then if you visit namus.gov under reports and statistics, you'll find all of the stats and graphs that I've showed you today, and you can go to this page and locate, view, and download the monthly data that we have in NamUs. Also on the NamUs website under library and multimedia, you'll find the step-by-step guide for entering a missing person case and using our advanced search features in the system. And that's what I have for you today. I thank you again for letting me join you to learn more about the NamUs program. I've provided my contact information here, and if you have any questions or need anything from me after today, please feel free to reach out.
Thank you so much, Jessica. It's always a pleasure to have you here with us. And really quick before you go, if I'm not mistaken, you will also train communities on this. Like if a community wanted to have a more expansive training so they can understand how to use the system, you're available for that, or if not, you have colleagues that are available. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct. Some of our travel is a little limited right now because of COVID, but I can always hop on a call or a Zoom meeting of sorts and do some more extensive training or one-on-one type of training as well.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. I appreciate your flexibility and making sure that we all have this information. One of the things that we're looking forward to from both Tanea, Jessica, and then Tracy and Elizabeth as they come forward and off camera is as part of the conference in May that we're doing this as a workshop, that you're going to be hands-on, please excuse me, that we're going to be hands-on, that we're going to dive deep and have room and spaciousness for learning more about how we can incorporate this work. So again, deep gratitude for you, Jessica. I appreciate you being here. Elizabeth and Tracy, I love to see you here. Thank you so much. You've always been so supportive of our work in Indian country. And sorry, I'm changing some screens around. And I think that you have been, both of you have been vocal supporters of how best you can show up in Indian country for us. And I think that folks who run agencies or who are supervisors or directors of agencies that may not have strong ties to Indigenous communities have something that they can learn from you around how to show up for us. So I certainly want to extend you that gratitude and call you out for the work that you've done with us. Again, about 15 minutes behind, so please take your time through your presentation. We'll get there. We're almost to the end, y'all. Thank you all for being here and staying with us. I will give you an opportunity to introduce yourselves and then go ahead with your presentation.
Thank you, Ty. We appreciate that very much, and we think we'll still be able to get people out in time. So my name is Tracy Whalen. I'm with the U.S. Attorney's Office. I've been here for 23 years. I'm the tribal liaison for both the Kootenai, the Coeur d'Alene, not both, and the Nez Perce tribes. Prior to that, I was a county prosecutor, and I work closely with Bernie on a number of cases, and just the highest respect for her. And with me is Elizabeth Pollisbull.
Hi, I'm Elizabeth Pollisbull. Thank you for having me. I joined the U.S. Attorney's Office about a year and a half ago. Before that, I earned my PhD in criminology and criminal justice, and I am happy to be here and sharing in this effort for such an important project.
So Ty, if we don't share it, I did have to touch my screen, even though you told me not to. So if it's wrong, please let us know. I'm gonna hit the share screen now. This one. Share.
There we go. Perfect. We see it, we hear it. It's exactly as we want it to be. Fantastic.
Okay. Prior to meeting, when we met with Bernie quite a while ago about what she wanted this conference to look like when she was looking at it as the 2-day conference, and what she wanted our part in that to be. And leading up to this, we have actually met with the speakers, except for Jessica and Ms. Park, because we wanted to make sure that we kind of had a cohesive message. You know, a long time ago, my mom told me that it was great to really go into life using your heart, because then you can be empathetic and compassionate to people and really make a difference. But she said, if you only use your heart, oftentimes things won't get done. And she said, and it's great that you have a brain and you use your head because you can get a lot done. But if you don't combine that with your heart, you can leave a lot of destruction in your wake. And I think what we've seen today in these various presentations is the head and the heart and why we need both. And certainly the stories of all of the women who have come before us and who have talked about, I think Ms. Park talked about not wanting to create a drama, how did you say, a drama show, drama porn, I think was the word she used. But those women who were brave and showed up and talked about the damage that has been done and the family members, that's important. That's the motivating factor for why we need to do something to combat this problem. But we also need the head, which is the data, and that Lane and Melanie put together so well, and that Tanea does with our clearinghouse, and Jessica put together for NamUs for us, and coming together. And so we just wanted to talk briefly about why there's a need for reliable data, because it is critically important. And to do that, you know, I just have a law degree. I don't have a PhD. I was lucky to pass statistics in undergrad, and luckily there's no such class in law school. So, so Elizabeth is much better at that. And our acting U.S. Attorney, Rafael Gonzalez, is very good at collecting data and making it available for everyone. But I just want to start with some basic definition, which is, you know, what we know. What we know is that Melanie and Lane both talked about quantitative and qualitative data. But does everyone who's in the conference, do we understand what that means? And so I've asked Elizabeth if she can give us definitions for qualitative versus quantitative.
Sure. So qualitative data is data that describes, as its name would imply, qualities or characteristics of the phenomenon that we're looking at. So that is why the narrative is so important. It gives us the context, the details, really provides a lot of that background information. But qualitative data is that which can be observed and not measured. So what we need to do is then convert that information into quantifiable measurements. So that's where quantitative data comes in. While qualitative data can describe the nature of the problem that we're looking at, the quantitative data is going to provide the extent of the problem. So it will answer the questions like, what is happening? How often? How many? So we really need both sides of this to get the scope of what we're dealing with. And then that will allow us to compare, regions or different groups. If maybe one community is seeing more juveniles go missing than another community, you can compare that, and then we can get to the bottom of how to get at the root of the problem.
And the other thing that we know, and has been stated, the very in our invocation, there was a talk about moving forward in our efforts, and Bernie talked about the fact that there's a lack of corroboration, lack of data, lack of consistent advocacy, and sometimes a lack of laws. And we know from the data that that is borne out, because what did Melanie and Lane tell us? They told us that 77%, I believe, was the number of people, of Indigenous people, are off the reservation and not living within the bounds of the reservation. That matches up with what Jessica from NamUs just showed, which is 78% of the reports of missing people were living off the reservation. So we have to corroborate and we have to collaborate. And I know, at least starting, you had at least two participants from the Idaho State Courts who are here wanting to participate. There are people from a broad spectrum. So what we know is there's a problem. What we know is that there's an interest in solving it. We know that you have committed people from multidisciplinary disciplines that want to do it. And we have to quantify that data of what we don't know. And some of what we don't know is, before this, there was a slide that had a whole bunch of things listed about what we don't know, but then because of Lane and Melanie's great report, nope, it's this one right here. Well, we can't see us anyway. But anyway, because of that, we do know things. So thank you for that report. But we don't know the reasons of why people are missing. And why we don't always know all the statistics is because of the inconsistent reporting practices. It's because of the very definitions of missing persons. And when we lack that input from law enforcement being able to put it in, then our data lacks reliability and validity. And those two words have very specific meanings that Elizabeth's going to explain to us in a way that maybe we can, or at least I could understand it better.
Sure. So reliability in statistics really just means consistency. So, and then in turn, the reliability will drive the validity of our research. So if we can become consistent in our reporting practices, become consistent in the data collection, the data inputting, collaborating, data sharing, all of that, that will make us have more consistent data and will help us understand what we're really measuring. So while reliability is consistency, validity is this concept of, are we measuring what we think we're measuring? If we are inconsistent in data collection, then we can't really be sure that we're measuring the number of missing persons throughout Idaho. So again, if people believe you cannot report a teen runaway as missing because they've run away on their own, we're not getting the whole scope of the problem. If in fact we can count them as missing. So we need to define missing persons, and we need to collaborate across the board so we're all dealing with the same definitions.
Can you share the definition of reliability that you gave me? Because I think it really put it if you're a visual learner, in a way that you can understand it.
Okay. So if I stood on a scale 100 times and it told me every time that I weighed 2 pounds, it's being consistent. I can rely on it to take a weight and spit something out. but obviously it would need to be recalibrated because I'm not measuring what I think I'm measuring. It's not a valid reading. It must be only getting the weight of the boots I'm wearing or something like that.
And so that's why you need the reliability and the validity.
Right.
Okay. And as the first speaker, Ms. Park, talked about, right, the three things that they were looking at is we need to explore the data, explore the resources, and explore the policies. And this data is what, unfortunately, in the world we live in, or fortunately, I don't know, it is what causes us to get funding. It's what causes the money to come out to recognize the problem and what we can do about it. I want to talk just for a moment about Operation Lady Justice and Savannah's Act. I believe everyone probably on this call, this hearing, has heard of Operation Lady Justice. It will expire by executive order in November. There were listening conferences set up around the country and reports written about what they found the tribal experience to be, and as it relates to MMIP. And there was a key part here, which was the best solutions to tribal issues come from tribes, and it is our responsibility to listen. And that's why you specifically had listening sessions. And then Jessica talked a little bit about Savannah's Act, and the Act's purposes are to empower tribal government with resources and information and increase coordination and communication among the various stakeholders. And what's important about that is we anticipate, and I know Dave Rogers is on the call and made a comment earlier, that the MMIP coordinators are helping draft those protocols. And I believe, and Bernie, I know you can correct me if I'm wrong, that one of the next steps, this is called the Next Steps Conference. The next step is, how do we get together to create those protocols so that there is recognition of the individuality of everybody, but there are consistent practices so that we have reliability and validity. What are the best practices for collecting and reporting and analyzing the data on missing or on unidentified human remains? How do we improve the law enforcement response? And so I think it's really, as we talk about what we're working towards, is creating protocols that state, federal, tribal, city, county governments can all work on. So we're doing the same. I know in conversations with our acting U.S. Attorney, Rafael Gonzalez, we talked about, who can we have on a call once a month when we say there are 6 missing persons in Indigenous persons in Idaho? Who are the 6 people, and has anything been done about it? Oops, sorry. And we've gone over that. I do want to commend, I know Billy Barkwin's on this call, and Tanea, you spoke earlier. They're working on these MOUs, which is a memorandum of understanding for amber alerts and silver alerts to bring the tribal communities to being able to to participate in those. And I know in just speaking to Tanea, that has been a great opportunity. She talked about learning how things work, and that some people don't report to law enforcement, they report to their tribal councils, and creating these MOUs so that that the procedures are there. And then finally, I think from everyone, and I certainly don't want to speak for Ty or the Idaho Council on Domestic Violence, but part of when we leave here is we can all attend conferences where we talk about things, but really, what will you do when you leave here? What steps can we all take collaboratively and individually to move this ball forward down the field? Will you require participation if you're a member of a tribal council of your law enforcement? Will you forge MOUs to participate in amber alerts and silver alerts? Will you take Melanie's survey so that she has data and get that back to her so she can look in May about what needs to happen? Will you help develop protocols? Will you look for grants to help fund updates for our clearinghouse? I mean, Sine is a one-woman show. Each of us can do something, and what will you do? And that's what we'd like to leave you with is this group has done amazing work. But as Ms. Park said, the policymakers have limited attention spans. And so what can we do to continue to support this? For our part, we're willing to do whatever, and we're just hopeful that, that the information that's been provided today will help you come up with ways that you can participate. Ty, that is, we just wanted to summarize it and get people out in time, but I think we covered really what we needed to.
That was great. And I love the high level look about what we need to do. Like I'm one of those people who, what is there to celebrate? Like, what can we breathe life into that we've done well? What are, like, being really honest and forthcoming about what our gaps are, about where we are missing knowledge and missing collaboration. And then I'm a futurist. I really love to dream big and into the future of like where we could go as we interrupt this violence. And I certainly appreciate everybody's participation today, everybody's insight, everybody's input. And we look forward to seeing you in person. I'm going to manifest this for us. We will come together in May 4th and 5th. May 5th is the National Day Awareness for Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women. So put it on your calendars. We'll dive a little bit deeper into some of these ceremonies and honoring victim and victim families and survivors. We will have working groups. Remember that you are coming to this conference to work with us so that we can build community around ending missing and murdered Indigenous relatives. And as we've seen from that report, we have to do this not only for Indigenous communities, but for Idaho in general, for the community. We are neighbors together. So I want to make sure that we're upholding and uplifting the work that could really end this for all communities. I don't want to be the last voice in this, Bernie. I actually want to invite you back into the space as you come off camera or come on camera and come off mute. Here's what I want to do. I'm going to give you all a couple of last minute items. I'm absolutely sharing the resources that you've seen today. I will absolutely send you a follow-up email. Again, we're going to drop Melanie's survey into the chat for you. We're going to drop the state report into the chat for you. Please, please stay in touch with the Idaho Coalition and stay up to date with the work that we're doing around missing and murdered Indigenous people. I'm certainly happy to have partners in this. If you are regional, if you are at another state coalition, but let me know and I will keep you on the email list. We've got a lot of work to do moving forward. And I'm certainly thankful that you all showed up today. Bernie, closing thoughts. You are the matriarch. You are the woman who brought us all together. What words of wisdom, what gift are we giving our attendees as they leave us today?
I want to thank all of you for participating and hanging out with us this afternoon. And I just want to, again, just thank all of the staff at the Coalition and the Idaho Council and Boise State and all of my presenters here. You know, I look forward to seeing all of you in May 4th and May 5th. If there is actually anything that you would really like us to cover, be sure to send Ty or myself or us an email, and we can certainly make that happen. We are planning a 2-day event, and we will be, as Ty said, it will be a pretty good working group. We hope to get some things accomplished out of this, the next conference. And then we also have a little more time to do more traditional ceremonies as well. So I hope that you all come back in May. At peace with all of you. Stay healthy in these trying times, and God bless. Thank you.
Thank you all. Take care.